Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new Decentralized Networks Governance workshop organized by the European Blockchain Observatory and Forum. My name is Ioannis Vlachos. I'm with the UBOF. Will be your moderator for the session today. And before starting with the several interesting topics that we will have today, let's start with some housekeeping rules. So the workshop is expected to have a duration of approximately 3 hours. To ask any question, please use the Q&A functionality of Zoom only. You can either ask a question with your name or anonymously. Also, if you wish to contribute or leave a remark, please do so with the chat. During presentations or while panels are in discussion, you can write up your questions in the Q&A, and the most relevant questions will be selected by the moderators of the panels to be directed to the panelists for getting the respective answers. Also, to mention that this workshop is being recorded. Only what is said and presented on the screen by panelists and the moderators will be recorded, so your questions will not appear in the recording. Also, the recorded version will be uploaded on the European Blockchain Observatory and Forum media channels a few days after this event. And without further ado, let me give the floor to Pekaris Glavis from DG Connect to set the scene and welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation to open the workshop today. Thank you, as always, to the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum for providing us with input from workshops, deep dives, academic reports into the very latest topics that are coming up in blockchain. Today is absolutely no exception. In fact, obviously, it's not a new topic. Decentralized governance is the very heart of what blockchain is about since the first Bitcoin white paper and all the blockchains that have come on afterwards, though obviously with the permission blockchains, you had a certain other area of development. We find it very interesting at the European Commission because though we are building a permission blockchain, but relatively decentralized in that there will be perhaps quite a few partners, not just the member states and the European Commission, but different entities within the member states, maybe regions, cities, a public-private partnership, public-private partnerships in its further development in the future. We are also working very hard to make sure that the whole ecosystem flourishes in Europe. So this includes also the completely decentralized applications or applications without permission. So today I think we're going to have some very interesting presentations. First of all, from the aforementioned European Blockchain Partnership of 20 countries, we have Nena Dozhkov on decentralized governance in public organizations, which is something that I think is very much on our agenda and probably of interest to a lot of you. Then I think a fascinating panel on the governance of decentralized finance. And I mean, this is a very apt time for it to come out because of the report of the World Economic Forum and Wharton that was led by our first member of the panel, Kevin Werbach, who I've had the pleasure of being in the Wharton group that he organizes with and have appreciated very much his books and insightful articles on blockchain. And he's also one of the kind of internet innovation pioneers from his time at the FCC earlier. Also being joined by Fabian Schaar from the University of Basel, Sheehan Jones, another definitely trailblazer in the area of digital assets and their regulatory frameworks. Also, Jacek Czernacki from MakerDAO of Poland, a young and upcoming startup in the area. And then from the Max Planck Institute, we have Michelle Fink, who has always been a very trusted advisor of ours when we've called upon her for her inputs, talking about the implications of decentralized network governance from a data law perspective, which is one of the difficult sides. Which we have a very full agenda, so I'm not going to keep reading the multiple people. But I think we see the legal and regulatory court considerations coming up afterwards. And as I mentioned, we are very much intending with the legislative initiatives that we have, markets in crypto assets, the pilot regulatory sandbox plus for distributed ledger technologies and market infrastructures, the recently adopted digital identity regulation, which includes self-sovereign ID and the legal recognition of electronic ledgers. And I want to signal for you as my final words, if you're interested in blockchain law and regulation, we have a public consultation open right now for the Data Act. And there we have questions on smart contracts. So if you see the potential, like we do, for smart contracts to help with data sharing that the individual or the enterprise wishes, where they want to manage it themselves in a way that they want to see the data shared, then please reply to this public consultation, or if you have a different view as well. So with that, I'm very happy to give the floor back to our hosts at the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, and to listen in on this fascinating conversation that we have ahead. Thank you again to all the speakers and all the participants.
Thank you, Petris, for your welcome notes and for setting the scene. So we are ready to kick off this webinar workshop today with the first presentation from Mr. Mario Laul, from governance researcher for Placeholder, and his presentation on a general overview of decentralized network governance. Mario, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the topic of my presentation is blockchain network and DAO governance. DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which is a type of organization that combines software-based automation with economic incentives, usually via tokens that are tracked and secured on a blockchain, as well as various forms of distributed, mainly online collaboration. And ideally, it does it so that no single entity is in complete control of the overall system. Keep in mind that not all blockchain networks or communities identify themselves as DAOs, and not all DAOs are operating their own blockchain networks, but for the sake of time and simplicity, I will be using these terms interchangeably throughout the presentation, and I will be focusing primarily on public permissionless networks. I will first give some general context, then my definition of governance, and finally, a brief general overview of what blockchain network and DAO governance consists of today. In 2003, Carlota Perez published a book titled Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. And in that book, she presents a theory of techno-economic paradigm shifts. One of the key propositions of her theory is that each technological revolution consists of two periods. First, there is an installation phase in which the core technologies and infrastructure of the new revolution are first introduced into the world. And then there is a deployment phase in which the broader social and institutional transformation enabled by these new technologies can be fully realized. Blockchain-related innovation belongs to the currently ongoing deployment phase of the ICT revolution, which includes the emergence of internet-native forms of organization and coordination. These new forms of organizing are increasingly digital, global, decentralized, and automated. If we zoom out even further, we can say that information technology amplifies certain tendencies that the famous German sociologist Max Weber identified as essential to the process of modernization. Blockchain networks and ICT more generally are inherently bureaucratic technologies, and the mass deployment and adoption of these technologies represents the continued hyper-rationalization of modern society. However, what used to be manual bureaucratic work, mainly the rules-based administration of information and facilitating transactions connected to that information, that work is now increasingly done by distributed networks of what I call middle machines. Very often when people talk about blockchain technology, they say that one of the benefits of this technology is that it helps to get rid of unnecessary intermediation and unnecessary middlemen. I think it's more accurate to describe blockchain technology as not disintermediating, but rather replacing the human intermediary with a machine. So instead of a middleman, you have a middle machine. Blockchains and DAOs are primarily a process or institutional innovation. They represent a new way for society to build, deploy, govern, and consume digital services. This innovation is centered around four things primarily. First, programmability, which is related to open source software development and automation. Second, composability, which currently is network specific, but is closely related to the well-known challenge of blockchain interoperability. Third, improved access and tamper or censorship resistance, which is related to cryptography and decentralization. And finally, governance, which is the topic of the rest of my presentation. I define governance as the process of applying any design feature or control mechanism that maintains and steers a system. This is a rather abstract definition, but the goal of this definition is to include certain things that are commonly not associated with this term. Specifically, this includes features that establish some control mechanism within the system on a relatively permanent basis, which is a form of institutionalization. In the case of blockchain networks done through software. And also mechanisms that don't require active human involvement to accomplish some tasks. So automation is itself a form of governance. On a very high level, blockchain network and DAO governance is a combination of free and open source software governance. Many public blockchain, or most all public blockchain projects really are also open source software projects, and there's a lot of similarities between these projects and traditional open source projects, as well as their governance. Second, corporate governance. In some cases, at the level of the DAO or the network as a whole, but more often at the level of individual contributors to the network, which very often are organized as traditional companies and thus also governed as traditional companies. And third, most importantly, novel forms of digital and online governance, including the use of crypto economic incentives, such as block rewards or transaction fees, which are usually denominated in network-specific coins or tokens. And the accumulation of these tokens often results in certain formal voting or governance authority. As I mentioned, it also includes automation as a form of governance, as well as the ability of participants in the network to freely enter and exit the system, including by forking the code or the underlying data, which historically has not been the case with conventional digital services. So who are the key stakeholders in blockchain and DAO governance? First, you have founders, developers, and operators. These are usually technical experts in their field. You have capital providers who often become token holders, and this includes institutional and retail investors. Then you have the broader base of users of the services provided by the network or the DAO. You have suppliers, technology providers, business partners, which may include other DAOs, and of course, regulators who also have a role to play in this emerging ecosystem. There may be overlap between different stakeholder groups, but depending on how power and resources are distributed between the three main groups, which are the technical experts, the capital providers, and the users, DAO governance can be described as more technocratic, more plutocratic, or more democratic. Most networks start out as technocratic. For more inclusive decision-making, a typical first step is to implement a token-weighted voting system, which effectively results in a plutocracy, perhaps a representative plutocracy if there's a delegation mechanism involved. And more democratic forms of network governance are currently underexplored, partly due to challenges with secure and decentralized identity verification, which is a requirement if you want to have a one person, one vote voting system, and partly also due to ideological objections to democratic forms of governance in the context of blockchain. There are two broad categories of network governance. The first one involves rules that are inscribed in the relevant software protocols, which may or may not include rules about the process of changing the as on-chain governance. And then you have rules and mechanisms that are external to the software protocols, which is the more extensive category. And this includes all forms of both online and offline community coordination and management. And this is what people have in mind when they use the term off-chain governance. Some concrete examples of DAO governance mechanisms. You have the pre-launch decision-making and coordination process, the most important aspect of which is the rules around the initial resource allocation, including the allocation of the network-specific coins or tokens. You have the core software development process and all the official documentation and communications around that. The first two are usually spearheaded by the founders of the project or a core developer team who provide the leadership, vision, and values that are then gradually adopted and reproduced by the broader community of participants in the network or the DAO. Then depending on the network, you have more or less formalized process for submitting governance proposals. Very often these proposals are subject to a token-weighted vote and may further require a digital signature by a smaller group of often community elected people before the proposal can be fully executed. This is what people usually refer to as a multi-sig. You may also have technical councils and other ad hoc committees involved in the governance process. Sometimes these governing bodies are elected by the token holders. Sometimes they are appointed by the core developer team and occasionally even self-appointed because these are open and permissionless systems that anyone can join. Throughout the ecosystem, there is an extensive reliance on Web 2.0 tools, especially GitHub for code collaboration, but also Discord, Twitter, and Telegram for coordinating the communication between different participants in the DAO. What are some key challenges in DAO governance? In general, these are not that different from what traditional organizations are struggling with. For example, DAOs need to balance the interests of different stakeholders, avoid the misuse of power and extractive behaviors. They need to figure out what is the appropriate organizational structure for their needs, including whether to use delegation mechanisms or not. And if they do, that introduces principal agent issues. DAOs have to manage change, resolve conflicts, including handle potential forks, as I mentioned earlier. There's the challenge of maintaining sufficient community engagement. If token holders are expected to participate actively in governance by voting, you need them to show up and actually do that. And all DAOs and networks, of course, have to achieve economic sustainability. There has to be a use case, a service, a value that they're providing to the world. And ideally, they should be able to develop some sort of an economic or revenue model around that service so that the DAO could sustain itself over longer periods of time. There's a question of what is the correct legal structure for the DAO or the network as a whole, if any, also for individual participants in the DAO. If the DAO is active in an area where traditional organizations are highly regulated, such as financial services, for example, there's the challenge of ensuring regulatory compliance. And the same with systemic stability concerns, and of course, all sorts of technical challenges relating to cybersecurity, which includes private key and identity management. There are more, but these are some of the main examples. Some recent trends in DAO governance. There's an increasing division of labor and specialization in the space. Many networks and DAOs have organized themselves into domain teams or core units, or describe themselves as a DAO of DAOs, an organization of organizations. Specialization naturally leads to professionalization in areas such as treasury management, financial analysis, or community coordination. As I mentioned, delegation is a very popular way to counter voter fatigue and improve the overall decision-making quality in the DAO. There's a growing recognition of the need for checks and balances, as well as accountability if certain actors in the system are expected to act on behalf of other actors, and increasing reliance on governance tools, interfaces, and aggregators, which are signs of growing standardization in the space. And both professionalization and standardization is causing what is known as institutional isomorphism. That is, more and more DAOs and networks are exhibiting similarities in the way they're structured and the way their processes work, even though they're independent organizations. If you would like to learn more about these isomorphic tendencies in DAO governance, as well as other points that I've made in this presentation, I recommend that you visit my Medium page. The link is visible now, and follow me on Twitter. There's not much one can fit into a 15-minute presentation, but I did my best, and I hope you found it informative. I believe there's another presentation before a Q&A now, but you're also always welcome to reach out to me privately if you have any questions. I will end with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mario. I think you succeeded in squeezing in 15 minutes all the terminology and jargon around DAOs and decentralized governance, so everyone will feel more comfortable following up with the presentations to come next. And speaking of presentations, we are delighted to have with us Nena Dokuzov, Head of Projects Group from the Ministry of Economic Development and Technology of Slovenia. And Nena is going to present us decentralized governance in public organizations. Nena, thank you for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here because when we were talking some years ago about participatory budgeting or participatory cooperation with of the different communities with the local authorities or the governmental authorities, we were just talking about this principle not facilitated by any technology. At least we didn't know the technology that can stand behind. And after that, when we started to talk about blockchain, we found it very useful for exactly for this concepts. So after that, we went a little bit further and we analyzed. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. We realized that we can also analyze that the democratic governance system not only for the civil society, but in the level of the governments and in the level of the companies. What was the major trigger or the driver for the analysis of decentralized governance systems in the companies? We found out that traditional companies are very hierarchically organized, and that open innovation concept cannot come into that hard and stable government structures in the companies. So we started to open the business sector through the open innovation, which can be also supported by blockchain technology and by decentralized, and lead to decentralized government system. Then we were thinking about how to put everything together. Not only it was very nice presentation before my presentation, but it is the governance system within the technology itself. I think that now when we are on the way to promote blockchain technology and to promote certain use cases that are cross-border, we have to think a little bit wider, because with this type of technology, we think that in a certain period of time, we will have social changes, we will have economic changes, and we will have also governmental changes that are going to be as a consequence of integrating that technology into a decision-making system. Maybe if I emphasize some points from fundamental principles and assumptions, we can talk about centralized organizations and the problem of scale. We know that centralized political organizations are organized in a way that can reach the consensus and coordination between different groups, distant groups of people, and then they can facilitate their mutual interactions. The second thing is state as a single point of failure. We know that if the functioning of the state is not optimal, then the whole system and its participants will be negatively affected. So the concentration of power can be dispersed by a blockchain technology very efficiently. Then the third principle that code is law. We know that the neutrality of the code and distributed consensus and auditability of transactions can significantly reduce or overcome frictions and failures which are inherent in decision-making process. We talk about power of individuals and politics by instant atomic interactions. Here we can put a lot of importance to the replacement of the human agents with the smart contracts and decentralized autonomous organizations. The sixth point is what we found very interesting, do it yourself concept in so-called Starbucks style public administration. Here we explain that the blockchain can be also used as a permanent public record repository to store all the government legal and administrative documents, such contracts, identification cards, passports, and so on. And it can be achieved in very in cheaper and the most efficient or more efficient way with the use of blockchain. Borderless globalized government services. Here we can emphasize the European blockchain services infrastructure, as Peteris also mentioned, the cross-border services that we are developing within European blockchain partnership and within that interoperable infrastructure that will enable to operate this infrastructure in decentralized and distributed way. Next, the systems of direct democracy. We know that with DAO and with DCO, we are talking also about the liquid democracy. These are new models of participation in decision-making process of citizens, of stakeholders in different communities, and that this is very efficient process for decision making. Further, Futurgy, this is voting for values while betting on belief. Here we talk or considering the predictions of markets, that citizens that vote for example, on proposals for achieving the results, and they, for example, get or lose tokens if they vote for something, or lose if they if their voted area is not successful in that voting process. Then we have a decentralized society based upon the state authority. Here we can think about decentralizing the excessive power of the state or of few people or few institutions, and to ensure the democratic decision process. It is also very relevant for blockchain technology and its functional characteristics. With this decentralized governance, we will definitely come to the new social contract. Maybe not to completely eliminate that centralized institutions, but to integrate different approach to different cases. Yeah, and we have here also a very interesting term. It's franchulates, a combination of franchise and consulate. This is the parallel system or system that is a role model for this when the private corporations have replaced the state in all its functions, and they are competing with each other to provide goods and services. With the purpose is that central institutions should not maintain the monopoly, and here we come also into the inherent concept of state aid questions that we are facing also within blockchain technology, or competition issues that can appear when positioning on different stages in the hierarchy of the social space or social environment. Yeah, and then we have the authority that is floating freely, cognitive dissonance, and societal maturity. We can talk here about that natural progression of humanity, and it is very important in some mature social system that is able to decide for itself. And with those cases, we can approach to decentralized government and to start to build blockchain using all its advantages that we can identify now, and using all these for example, disadvantages from the centralized system that we are facing today. So I would finish my presentation here. I would be very happy if I can continue debate in some other case. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for accepting the invitation, Anna, and thanks for let's say providing the perfect segue. So we let's say continue seamlessly to our first panel discussion for the day, which is about governance of decentralized finance. The panel session will be moderated by Assistant Professor Dr. Agata Ferreira of the Warsaw University of Technology. Also, Agata is a member of the expert panel of the European Blockchain Observatory. We have the pleasure to work with her. So, Agata, the floor is yours to start your session and present your panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. I hope everyone can hear me well and can see me well. So, hello and welcome to the very first panel discussion of this workshop. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel. My name is Agata Ferreira, and I'm a lawyer, advisor, scholar, and university assistant professor focusing on legal and regulatory issues related to technology, fintech, and in particular, blockchain technology and its development. I'm also a UK qualified solicitor, and I spent several years practicing law in London financial sector, in a leading law firm, and in an investment bank. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at the Warsaw University of Technology, and I'm a guest professor at a number of other universities in Europe. I'm a member of Advisory Council of Blockchain for Europe, and also member of expert panel at the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, our host and organizer of today's event. I'm very honored and humbled to be joined in this panel session by our speakers, top professionals in this space and authorities on the topic. So please welcome in alphabetical order, first Jacek Czarnecki, who is Global Legal Counsel at the Maker Foundation, lawyer in crypto since 2014, involved in a number of crypto and DeFi legal and policy initiatives. Welcome, Jacek. Welcome Xian Jones, who is a senior partner at the Boutique Policy and Regulatory Affairs Consultancy, XREC Consulting, which focuses on crypto assets. Her extensive experience in policy formulation and regulatory development is leveraged by government, public authorities, and crypto asset businesses. She previously architectured Gibraltar's DLT regulatory framework, is a former financial services regulator with a technical expert on FATF policy development group, dealing with virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. She's also a contributor to the Wharton World Economic Forum DeFi Policymaker Toolkit. Xian is outspoken about blindly applying to crypto assets and DeFi rules established for traditional finance and CeFi. She is no stranger to challenging how the same rules, principle, and concept of technological neutrality are interpreted. So welcome, Xian. Next is Fabian Schar, who is a professor for distributed ledger technology and fintech at the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Basel. In addition, Fabian is also managing director of the university's Center for Innovative Finance. He has a PhD in crypto assets and blockchain economics, and his research is at the intersection of economics and computer science, with a particular focus on public blockchains, crypto assets, and decentralized finance protocols. He's a board member of the first FINMA-regulated crypto asset manager and a member of CPR Research and Policy Network on FinTech and Digital Currencies, an advisor to the Multi-Chain Asset Managers Association and Blockchain for Europe, and member of various World Economic Forum working groups, and an invited expert to hearings by the OECD and IOSCO. And last but not least, please welcome Kevin Werbach, who is a world-renowned expert on business, legal, and social implications of emerging technologies. He's a professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, a former counsel for new technology policy at the US Federal Communications Commission. He spent the past 2 decades exploring major trends at the intersection of the internet, digital media, and communication. He also served on the Obama administration's presidential transition team and helped develop the US government's internet and e-commerce policies in the Clinton administration. So welcome my panelists. I'm very pleased to be here. And we have already heard earlier that DeFi is a nascent phenomenon. It lacks actually agreed set of definitions, clearly defined terminology. It has been described as anything from protocol stack to loosely defined collection of ideas and projects, a movement, even an economic paradigm shift. So DeFi does not refer to any one specific thing or feature or project, but rather an idea of an alternative new financial system built on the premise of decentralization and disintermediation enabled through blockchain. So it signifies the entire emerging ecosystem of composable building blocks of DeFi, financial primitives, of underlying blockchain networks, crypto assets, the whole community of developers, operators, and participants. So from these new fundamentals, we see emerge traditional financial products and services like lending and borrowing. And what is significant are not the products and services themselves, but the fact that they are built and delivered through entirely new financial architecture, principles, and philosophy. It's a multidimensional and very dynamically evolving phenomenon that is part of this progressive decentralization enabled by a set of technological tools of blockchain technology. So the topic is complex, new, and to give a brief outline to start with, I would like to ask Kevin to present World Economic Forum collaboration project, which has resulted in 2 papers, as far as I understand, being recently published dedicated to DeFi. So Kevin, the floor is yours. Please tell us in a few minutes about this project and its findings.
Great, thank you very much, Agata, and also Peteris, for the very kind introductions. The project that I lead at the Wharton School at Penn looks at a number of different issues around blockchain and digital assets, especially as connected to regulation and policy. We have a work stream specifically on governance, which I'm not going to talk about today, but given the topic of the event, if anyone's interested in that, I'm putting in the chat the link to that website, and we're interested in hearing from anyone who wants to work further on assessing governance mechanisms generally of blockchain networks and applications. The project that we're talking about today relates to Defy, decentralized finance, as you've heard. This is something that has been around for a number of years, but really took off in 2020. At the peak last month, there were over $80 billion of digital assets locked in DeFi contracts, basically provided as liquidity or collateral funds to be available to use in various kinds of DeFi applications. So this has gotten regulators, policymakers, public authorities around the world very interested. And I've gotten, as really many people in the space have gotten, many questions over the past year about what DeFi is and what are the issues that it raises. So we're going to focus specifically for this session on governance, but I wanted to just briefly give some context of the project with the World Economic Forum. We released two papers. The major one was just released yesterday. It's called the DeFi Policymaker Toolkit. Let me just give some very brief highlights to provide some context. You've already heard a little bit about what DeFi is, but one of the key questions that we had to address in this report was defining DeFi in a regular and formal way, because there are lots of things that people might call DeFi. There are lots of ways people can approach it. So we spent a good deal of time working with a large network of experts. All the panelists on this panel were contributors to the project, but if you look at the report, there's more than 50 people that are listed in the acknowledgement section, and there are many more, including representatives of many governments around the world who participated in workshops or otherwise contributed to the development and review of this paper. And so we tried to understand broadly what DeFi was and came up with these four elements. First of all, it's about financial services or products. So there are many aspects that are related to DeFi. For example, Oracle services that bring data from outside the blockchain into the decentralized application that may be necessary. If you've got, for example, a DeFi service that needs some understanding of the price of some asset, that may not be available on the blockchain, but that's not a financial service itself. So DeFi, first of all, involves financial services. Secondly, trust minimization. And that means essentially settlement on a blockchain. The biggest percentage of DeFi activity today is on Ethereum, but there's significant and growing activity on a number of other permissionless public blockchains. And then trust minimized operation. The execution of these transactions is by smart contracts. There is not a traditional centralized financial intermediary which is in the process of managing the transaction. So that's what distinguishes DeFi also from much of the existing blockchain and cryptocurrency activity. Centralized cryptocurrency exchanges are not DeFi. They're transacting in digital assets, but they are controlling the transaction. Whereas DeFi type services decentralize that activity where all of the operation is functionally based on the smart contracts. Third is non-custodial. So in traditional financial services, the intermediary takes custody. It takes control of the assets. It has the power and ability to do what it wishes with those assets. Now that's constrained legally and operationally and in various ways, but there still is a requirement of trust in those decentralized entities. DeFi relationships are generally non-custodial. Generally, the holders of the digital assets maintain control of their assets, and yet they are still transacted and manipulated through the DeFi protocols. And finally, programmable, open, and composable architecture. You heard a little bit about this already from Mario's presentation at the beginning. DeFi basically treats financial primitives as what we call sometimes money Legos. They are composable units that can be mixed and matched and integrated in different ways. These are all based on open protocols, and there's scope for interoperability. Now, interoperability is not perfect, and it's certainly highly imperfect across base layer blockchains. But there's work going on to improve that interoperability. And this fourth one is really what enables DeFi potentially to go far beyond what traditional financial services can do. You can use DeFi to engage in an activity such as exchanges or lending relationships or derivatives creation or insurance that are analogous to activities in traditional finance, but that's just a starting point. Because again, it's all these building blocks on these common blockchain platforms. So the report that we issued in partnership with the World Economic Forum, and I should give thanks to Sheila Warren and Sumedha Deshmukh, who were my counterparts at the World Economic Forum. But as I said, this was a team effort of a large number of people around the world. Our goal was to help policymakers, regulators, supervisory authorities, and others understand the issues. We did not recommend particular decisions, but we tried to provide frameworks. So the first step was an overview of the DeFi ecosystem. I've given you a brief highlight of some of the key elements, but there's much more detail in the report about different layers in the DeFi stack and understanding just what this world looks like. The second is identifying risks. What we heard very clearly from governments was that they had all these concerns, or they heard about all these concerns, but it was hard to understand what the scope of them was, how they relate to each other, how they're the same or different than traditional finance. So we mapped out 5 different categories, 5 or 6 different categories of risks, and went into them in detail. Governance was one major risk area we talked about, which I think we'll focus on more in this panel. And then third, a set of potential policy approaches. Again, not specific recommendations, but how policymakers can think about DeFi to balance the need to address important public policy issues, preventing financial crime, protecting investors, and so forth, with the desire not to cut off desirable innovation. And then finally, a set of tools. You see there on the slide, one of them, this was a decision tree that we put in the report. I won't talk about this in any detail, but the toolkit has a variety of these resources that policymakers can use to map out and understand what to do about these emerging applications. So the last thing I'll say is that we welcome questions, feedback, follow-up, opportunities for collaboration, opportunities to do specialized workshops with particular organizations. I put my email there as well as the link to the report. In just a sec, I can put that in the chat as well. As you heard, there was a previous paper that's more of an overview about what DeFi is. You can also find that paper, DeFi Beyond the Hype, linked to the same WEF page. So let me just with that stop the sharing. I'll put the URL here in the chat as well. And would just encourage anyone to take a look at that, and we welcome your thoughts. And then I'm looking forward to this discussion. As I said, governance was one of many issues we talked about. It's not a necessary condition of DeFi that there be decentralized governance, but it's certainly very much in line with the way these DeFi applications and protocols work, and a really central area and practice of the DeFi ecosystem.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. This is a really wonderful introduction, and these 2 papers, which I have read myself as well, are really very helpful for anyone that would like to understand this phenomenon and to systematize the knowledge about it. So thank you very much. And what we have here is a few interesting features. So on one hand, we have traditional financial services, which can be provided through DeFi, like lending, borrowing, etc. And we know that CeFi, financial sector, is heavily regulated, subject to significant regulatory scrutiny and oversight, particularly after the last financial crisis, and there are reasons for this stringent regulation. On the other hand, we have this new parallel financial system emerging, which is borderless, disintermediated, permissionless, so almost complete opposite of an architecture on which traditional finance sector is built. So my question to all the panelists now will be, how do you govern such space? Mario has earlier already briefly described some possible governance models, but I wanted to ask you, what are the main governance models in use? how decisions are being made in this dispersed community, conflicts and disputes, how are they resolved, and it changes, adjustments, updates, etc. So my question is open to all the panelists. Please pick up this question as you feel fit. What are the main governance models for this new, entirely different to what we know financial space?
Yeah, I can just start briefly and say what we talked about in the report at a high level was 3 kinds of DeFi governance. That you can have centralized governance where typically a development team creates a protocol, creates the smart contracts on a blockchain, and maintains control over all of the relevant governance decisions. A more decentralized approach, which we call partially decentralized, is that there's typically a token issued, which grants some sort of voting rights, but that in order for decisions to actually be implemented, there's a list of authorized signers that are the only ones who have the permission and the keys to make changes to parameters of the system in the smart contract. And then finally, there's fully decentralized governance, where token holders vote, and the votes are directly implemented, typically in a DAO structure, as you heard about in the initial presentation. That's at a very high level, but many of the DeFi protocols and platforms, including MakerDAO, have implemented some of these systems in particular ways.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So maybe we move on and ask a follow-up question, and perhaps Jacek can shed some light on that. From your point of view, from Maker point of view, what are the challenges of these different governance models that you can use, and what are the possible risks? What are the challenges in implementing any of the governance models that was mentioned earlier?
I think that's an excellent question, and actually the beginning of your question is the best, because you asked about the point of view of Maker, and now I don't know what to answer here, because it is actually a very fascinating situation that it's very much related to the topic of this panel and our discussion, which is that the Maker Foundation, the entity that has been the main actor in the Maker community for the past 2 years, is actually dissolving at the moment. So the system is actually completely decentralized at this point, and it's difficult to say who is the representative or who is the spokesperson for the DAO. This is a very complex question, because we as the foundation, we kind of fulfilled that role as being the main educator about the system for the past years, but now that the decentralization is so advanced that there is basically no need for such an entity. And now, directly to your question, I'd like to pay your attention to one specific aspect. This is a very broad and complex topic, but I think that we can really see decentralization and various governance models in action when we consider how they interact with the external world. This is actually what matters most, because for the projects themselves, or even in the crypto bubble, I mean, not economic bubble, but like social bubble and governance bubble, of course, how these projects operate and interact with each other is important. But actually, you can really see the real operation and the real extent of decentralization, of how they interact with the external world in 2 ways. The first one towards the original creators, or the people, entities that were driving the development originally. And secondly, with respect to various types of integrations with the system. And now, taking Bitcoin as an example, it is completely decentralized in the first context, right? I mean, it has nothing to do with the original creators or creator. And secondly, it is also completely decentralized because anyone can integrate with the Bitcoin protocol in many various ways. And now, when you look at various DeFi protocols, the situation may or may not be different, right? So first, you still have some forms of at least partially centralized governance models in which there is a driving force behind the protocol. Even if it's decentralized in practice, they may be an actor or an entity that is driving the entire process. And secondly, with respect to how DeFi protocols operate today, and especially this desire to integrate with the traditional financial system and onboard, especially onboard real-world assets, this is a very interesting moment in which the DeFi protocols, even if completely decentralized, have to interact with those assets and traditional financial institutions which are centralized. Sometimes it's about onboarding of permissioned assets by those permissionless infrastructures. And this is where those governance models are going to be tested, I think, mostly. This is the real verification and test of those models and whether they actually make sense for financial services. And we see the first experimentation, and I encourage everyone to take a look at the Maker model, because at the moment, the decentralized governance of Maker is exactly considering onboarding some real-world assets coming from the traditional financial system.
Thank you very much, Jacek. This is really fascinating. If you think about the level of decentralization you have achieved and how you still have to continue with certain governance models. I would like to ask the same question perhaps to Fabian as well, and then to Sean. If you could shed some light on these risks and challenges that governing such structures pose.
Yeah, I first like to add an additional governance model, and it's a really simple one. When you cannot change anything, when you have just a static protocol, the static smart contract. It's actually the one that in many cases might be best suited for decentralized finance, because then it's really decentralized in the sense that nobody can change anything about it, right? Now, the big drawback, obviously, that you have is when you cannot change anything about it, then it's static by design. You cannot update it when there are any flaws detected in this protocol, and you might have issues you cannot correct. So it's really this trade-off between having something that is completely decentralized, serves as this decentralized infrastructure, and something that is potentially a little more centralized but more reactive as well when something goes wrong. So to me, I also categorize three different models, but slightly different: no intervention, intervention through tokens, and then intervention through admin keys, which are just predefined centralized entities. And in terms of the development, I think the ones that are more on the centralized side, they will get a lot of regulatory scrutiny from policymakers and regulators around the world. They will basically merge with the traditional financial system, whereas I expect the ones that are completely decentralized, that are somewhat static or have a governance token that is as a lot of owners, as a diverse set of owners, may be robust to some form of regulation. I think that's really interesting, that we have a new type of organization that undermines the effectiveness and also the need for regulation to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Fabian. And the last word on that question to you, Sean, what is your perspective on those challenges that governing centralized structures bring?
I think the challenges for DeFi governance is that it ultimately relies on people to undertake initial deployment. So however things go beyond there, and Kevin and Fabian have very eloquently sort of addressed four typologies there. You know, someone's got to put it out there, or a group of people have got to put it out there, and ultimately that's where regulatory focus will have to be honed in on. I think one of the challenges is that the whole of DeFi is probably going to end up being highly bifurcated. So you're going to have the industrialized DeFi, which isn't necessarily DeFi at all, or which some people would consider partially decentralized, but which policymakers and regulators already made clear. You know, partial decentralization isn't going to be sufficient. You know, someone doing something somewhere in the mechanism, whether or not they make anything directly from it, it becomes almost an irrelevance, and they'll home in on those folks, and so that makes it less and less comfortable. But ultimately, you're going to have the industrialized piece and the more truly decentralized piece, and the way that Kevin has, I think, very eloquently highlighted from the report. What is this going to lead to? Well, probably increasing an increasing amount of anonymous development, stuff that is simply put out there, Nakamoto-like, you know, where you know, years later, still nobody knows who's been responsible for it. Possibly with a whole sort of set of pieces broken up in that in the development and deployment, but that no one person has made anything that does anything until you put it all together, a bit like happens in the nuclear industry. You know, you can have an aluminium tube that may or may not, you know, be of any significance in weapons proliferation or in sanctions and so forth, until the use is found for it, and that requires putting some things together potentially. So I think all these represent a load of challenges. As the challenges are addressed, begin to be more addressed, then I think we are at risk of finding protocols and networks that are deployed, shall we say, prematurely, without adequate testing, without being thoroughly proven, and that then comes with additional risks. So there's some thoughts of mine on.
Thank you very much. So thank you for your thoughts. It looks like a lot of challenge ahead, and testing times, as Jacek has said, and from different directions. But from regulatory point of view, it might be last frontier for regulators to conquer. But at the same time, it's also a time of enormous opportunity, because this is creating something completely new, brand new space, so brand new technology, which brings a lot of opportunities. So I would like to ask you now, what are, we talked about challenges and risks, but what are the opportunities for building new governance models for this space? What are the best things about that, the opportunities that we can really leverage on? Open question, whoever would like to pick it up. So maybe we start with you, Kevin.
Okay, I'll start. No, I'm sure we all have a lot to say, but so this is an extraordinary opportunity for experimentation we've had. There are many historical examples of community-based or decentralized governance. Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in economics for work on commons-based governance and looked at many examples in practice, but that's mostly in small, fairly close-knit communities. So, here now, we have experiments like, for example, the one that Jacek talked about with MakerDAO, which has billions of dollars of assets now locked in smart contracts to provide collateral for a stable coin. There is not going to be any formal entity that is at the center of that process. And instead, holders of a token will have authority, and they do have authority now over these important decisions. And so one opportunity is to create new kinds of trust, not trusting in a central entity that might create a source of risk. One opportunity is changing the way that we think about the dynamics of governance to focus more on incentives. So basically, the idea of token-based governance is that you have skin in the game, you have the token, and that should cause you to make decisions that are in the interest of the protocol, and collectively that results in good decisions. We are still very early in understanding how to ensure this works at scale. Sean is absolutely right in terms of the some of the issues in scaling up and industrializing. But I think this is a great opportunity to see this working. Now, the opportunity is always paired with the risks, and there have been situations where, for example, there's been very low participation in governance, or there has been manipulation where people virtually acquire a lot of tokens and use it to attack the protocol. But again, we have the opportunity to see in practice if there's sufficient protection and sufficient disclosure and understanding of risks, what those dangers are, and then are there solutions? The major DeFi projects are constantly trying to develop new kinds of responses. So I think that's very exciting in light of the opportunities to truly have global decentralized control over very large and important activities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Kevin. So I would extend this question and ask maybe what are the opportunities to design governance models that go beyond what we have in our traditional financial system. So now we have technological tools to actually develop certain mechanisms that would dispense of regulation itself. So what opportunities do you see there for governance? Jacek, maybe you go ahead.
I think that we can speak about many theoretical opportunities as the concept, of decentralized governance models and DAOs is not new. It has at least a few years, and there were many also, not only theoretical explanations but also practical implementations of these ideas. But none of those actually has really taken off before DeFi, right? We had so many projects, even major ones, trying to provide frameworks for creating DAOs. But what I think is one of the conclusions is that it only makes sense if you have a specific system or product which actually needs this governance. So what I think that many projects have failed trying to build generalized decentralized governance models that would be applicable to various use cases depending on the needs. None of those projects were successful. So one of the questions is why DeFi was this exact space in which those decentralized governance models are thriving. And to me, I'm a great fan of those minimized governance or no governance, as Fabian said. At the same time, this is like there is a limited possibility to apply no governance model to many types of systems. And actually, governance is this difficult thing. If you have a complex system in which you know that you have to react to the changing reality, you have to apply certain governance. So I would say that to me, governance is a kind of like a side effect to everything else which you have in the blockchain space, right? I mean, the fact that you don't have a centralized entity, and at the same time you need to have decision-making process in order to deal with this, results in a requirement or a need for a decentralized governance. But it's very often it's not just about technology. It is, and it's also about incentives. It's about a proper design of the system, but at the same time this is also about creating social structures, and I think this is what makes it very interesting. And especially if you look at those early communities like Ethereum or Bitcoin, because you can also think about those as decentralized models. I mean, there is no software development company that is able to impose certain standards on top of those communities. You have certain decentralized model, which is not on chain, right? This is very interesting. It is decentralized, but it's not on chain. You can see that actually the social consensus and the certain culture driven by from inception of those models is crucial. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I would say that decentralized governance is just a must for this type of systems. But it is also powerful because when you have it combined with transparency, which open blockchains give you, this is actually something that is very, very powerful, because you can have a governance system that is very transparent and able to be audited basically by anyone watching from the outside. So I would say that the governance is like a must. I think that many people would like to avoid rather, and then create non-governance based systems like immutable smart contracts. But at the same time, the decentralized governance combined with all the other advantages of public blockchains create this value proposition. So to sum up, I would look at decentralized governance not in abstract, but in the context of particular applications in particular, for the particular needs.
Thank you very much, Jacek. I agree with what you said. It's potentially very powerful structure, powerful tool, multidimensional, including the social context. So repeating the question to the remaining panelists, Fabian and Xian, what opportunities do you see there in that context of building something brand new, powerful, and multidimensional for these networks?
Well, my start point is that I used to believe in direct democracy, and then in my home country we had the Brexit referendum, and I had to rethink that. Now, of course, I live in the EU, so life is much better here. But more seriously, I think that the golden opportunity is to do regulation better. Actually, the traditional world regulatory methodologies work rather poorly. They exist, and policymakers believe they're the only thing that can be done. But actually, they're very wrong in that. And DeFi governance models can be exploited to build in much better regulation into those infrastructures. Unfortunately, at the moment, the DeFi community probably doesn't recognize the significance of that piece, and the consequence of that is that it's heading towards confrontation with policymakers globally, and this is not a good place to be. But it's not too late to change direction and actually use governance, DeFi governance, and to develop entirely new methods of DeFi governance that haven't yet been considered, to build in regulation by design and do stuff better. But there needs to be a recognition by all sides that that's actually something of value. At the moment, I don't see that, but that's a fantastic opportunity.
Thank you, Fabian. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but just one thing. I think the main difference is transparency. That's the biggest potential, because let's face it, I mean, we have so much experience for thousands of years with governance mechanisms, and just the fact whether it's on-chain or off-chain in a more traditional setting doesn't change that much. I mean, you can pretty much replicate anything we have collected experience with in the past thousands of years on-chain, right? And there is no reason to believe that anything we have done so far suddenly is obsolete just because of blockchain. So I think many of the existing governance models can also be used on-chain. But the big difference in many cases is the transparency. And you can actually see that, and they can encode it, and you can see that everything has been done cleanly. And then there is also another difference. It's not necessarily just an advantage or an opportunity. I think it goes both ways. But whenever even if you have something that is a governance system that's built entirely on chain, you always have the option of forking that protocol, of just taking the code and creating a new one with slightly different rules. So there always is this implicit veto right, where you can just create a similar protocol with slightly different rules. And that's also part of governance, not of that specific protocol, but you can take that protocol and adapt it. And if you're not happy, you have that veto right. And I think that's a really interesting part.
Mm-hmm. So lots of opportunities there. Thank you very much for that, Fabian. Lots of opportunities, but also we are very early in that stage, and it looks like testing times ahead indeed. And I also wanted to refer to what Xian mentioned earlier, that confrontation that we are now looking at between regulators that slowly wake up to this space, and the space itself that very often the participants are not aware of many of the regulatory and compliance, etc. Implications. So taking all of this into account, my probably last question, because we are unfortunately running out of time, which is a pity because there's so much to discuss. Taking all of this into account, what do you think is the likely future direction for governance of DeFi? And does increasing complexity of DeFi impact? Sorry, I got muted for a second. So repeating the question, does the increasing complexity of DeFi impact its governance model, or will impact? And that regulatory scrutiny that is coming, is it likely to shape the governance of DeFi? What do you think, Kevin?
Yes, especially on that last one. And again, that was one of the motivating factors in this report we did with the World Economic Forum. Regulators appropriately have a set of concerns. One set of concerns has to do with these decentralized token-based governance systems themselves. In that even though the tokens only provide governance rights, so ability to vote on certain kinds of changes to the protocol, there's some indication that, at least with some of these projects, people are buying the tokens predominantly out of desire for appreciation in the value of the token rather than any real interest in participation in governance. So one set of concerns is whether this is legitimately governance or this is basically a way of masking a sort of initial coin offering type of relationship. I think that's an appropriate set of questions, and I think they're good responses, but that's going to certainly influence these projects. Another thing that from a regulatory standpoint is going to be important is regulators have concerns. For example, prevention of money laundering and other financial crimes. And the question then is, what or who has the ability to provide those kinds of guarantees or assertions on behalf of a DeFi project? And at some level that, if it's a decentralized project, relates to those who have influence over the governance process. And so there's going to be a lot of back and forth. I think the right answer is certainly not to prohibit these services or prohibit decentralized governance. But we've already seen, for example, large holders of governance tokens in projects like Uniswap not voting. Votes have not had a quorum. And large holders like major venture capitalists like Andreessen Horowitz delegating voting control of their tokens to student groups, actually, including student group at my own university. And while that's wonderful in terms of giving students ability to participate in governance, you also have to ask the question of why that's happening, why the token holders don't want to vote themselves. It appears to be in large part out of concern about liability and responsibility, that if they do vote, that either gives them some legal responsibility over the outcome of the vote or some broader legal responsibility over the project. So these are questions we need to resolve. Again, I don't think the right answer is governance needs to stop this if they can't definitively control it. But we need to have a dialogue and ensure that where there are legitimate policy concerns, and again, the report goes through a large number of them, that there are ways to address those concerns. And not all of those are directly in the DeFi system itself. Some of them have to do with, for example, what sorts of know your customer checks happen with onboarding to the cryptocurrency that you need to use the DeFi protocol. But I think a lot of the evolution of governance systems will partly be based on just operational issues, making sure they work and can't get hacked and are robust and scale, where again, we're still in an early stage, as well as responding to these regulatory concerns and balancing the desire of regulators to have confidence with the desire to allow for this beneficial transparency that we've heard about.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm being informed that we are running out of time, so I would like to give an opportunity to remaining panelists to also comment on where do you see the governance model kind of going? How do you think it's going to be shaped going forward, taking all the scrutiny into account and growth and increasing complexity? Jacek, what do you think? How do you observe that process?
Well, I will not dare to provide expectations, but I will express one hope, which is that the regulators and policymakers actually engage in those governance systems, because actually experiencing them is probably the best way to see how those systems work. I mean, in good and bad ways. And many of those systems are actually open. So there is like actual real discussion happening on open forums, and anyone can participate. And surprisingly, this is going relatively well. So I think that this is like learning firsthand how it works rather than focusing on theoretical concepts is something like I said, is a certain homework for regulators. And one opportunity that I'm clearly seeing are certain opportunities which governance models on open blockchains really give us. And I will provide you with one example, which I saw in one of the recent DeFi projects, which is about giving, in that case, this is about another stablecoin. But one fantastic feature is that there is a governance framework, but actually stablecoin holders get to decide, which doesn't mean that they are expected to actively manage or govern the entire system, but they get to veto certain decisions. And now imagine, in the context of traditional financial industry, users of financial products are just recipients, right, of decisions made at the top of governance layers by banks or other financial institutions. Here they can actually oppose to certain decisions, major decisions that can impact them. And this type of beautiful features is something that I hope will be explored and potentially adopted by the traditional financial system in some form as well.
Thank you very much, Jacek. Thank you. That's very helpful and hopeful, which is a good thing. So, Fabian, what do you see? How do you see these governance models transforming or adjusting to the environment that they are currently in?
Yeah, I think we will see a move towards the two extremes. So currently there is a lot in the middle ground where you have it's somewhat decentralized, but then again, you have some dependencies, some special privileges, and some Oracle dependencies, and you name it. And I think the regulators will step in there. So these protocols, they will probably be pushed towards a more regulated environment. And then on the other hand, the ones that don't have any of these dependencies, the ones where you have not a concentrated, but a somewhat decentralized governance token or no governance system at all. They will be, as Jan said, somewhat in the domain of anonymity and completely decentralized. So I think it's really these two extremes, and everything in the middle will disappear.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Do you agree with that, Jan, or you have different predictions?
Well, my prediction's a little bit less optimistic, although I continue to share Jacek's hope for something better. But I think what I see is DeFi becoming more. One part of DeFi becoming a lot more regulation resistant by design, which is only going to motivate and force policymakers to double down on their efforts, sadly, to concern themselves more with how to make the existing rules fit crypto and DeFi rather than and blindly kind of looking at the sort of how to apply the same rules and principles and technological neutrality concepts without actually understanding the nuances of them, sadly. So I'm a little bit I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I'm afraid, but ever hopeful.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation. I really wish we could continue, and I hope we get to continue in the future, because we are at the outset of this process. I think we're just beginning this discussion, really, and there is a lot of changes coming and a lot of developments which will shape this discussion. So I look forward to see you in the future at different panels, discussions, and contributions. Thank you very much for your participation today, and I give the microphone back to the organizer.
Thank you, Agatha. Thank you, Kevin, Jacek, Jan, Fabian, for a wonderful discussion. I think you set the Q&A session on fire with your discussion. And yeah, for all participants in the panel, please feel free to offline answer any of the questions that you can answer. And yeah, next on the line, Michelle Fink from Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition to explore with us implications of decentralized network governance from a data law perspective. Michelle, thanks for accepting the invitation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. Now, let me briefly try to share my screen. Right, so what I will try to cover in this very brief presentation of mine is an overview of the implications that decentralized network governance has from a data law perspective. And really, I think that when we look at blockchains, you know, I think many people are trying to understand blockchains and the innovation and disruptions that they might bring from a technological perspective, looking at, you know, what is the technological innovation and potentially disruption here. But I think oftentimes the more helpful lens to look at this new technology is actually an institutional perspective. So I think in many ways we can better understand this new technology when we ask the question of what is the institutional innovation and disruption that this technology may bring in the future. And if that is the question that we're answering, and we're tying this to a data law perspective, the relevant insight is that blockchains try to decentralize control over data across different parties that may or may not know and that may or may not trust another, and conversely be able to coordinate among another. And of course, those different parties can also be based in a large range of different jurisdictions. And this, of course, has a whole range of implications, including from the perspective of EU data law. And I will try to zoom in on two different potential implications today, namely what this institutional innovation means from the perspective of data protection law, in particular for the definition of the data controller under the GDPR. And I will also say a few words about an ongoing regulatory discussion in the EU, which relates to the proposed Data Governance Act. Now, starting with data protection law, in the EU context, data protection law is built around this figure of the data controller. Data law really focuses on creating accountability for the processing of personal data. And the data controller is the natural or legal person upon which the resulting obligations fall. The data protection law recognizes that there can be either be one single data controller, right? This would be the example of, for instance, Facebook, when we talk about the processing of personal data through the social media platform. But there can also be a range of different joint controllers in relation to a single data processing operation. And indeed, due to the increased decentralization of data processing in the context of blockchains, but also beyond, as well as the expanding definition of the data controller under EU law, joint controllers are more and more common today. Now, I tried to explain very briefly what the data controller actually is and what its obligations are, but I haven't yet outlined how the GDPR defines the data controller. And the legal definition of the data controller is the entity that controls the means and the purposes of personal data processing. And the means essentially refers to the how data is being processed, whereas this notion of the purposes relates to the why. So the GDPR tells us that the natural or legal person that determines both the how and the why of personal data processing is the data controller, and the data controller is the entity that needs to ensure protection with any and all obligations arising under the GDPR. Now, this legal definition of the data controller has been subject to considerable modifications over the past couple of years. And those modifications are really, really significant in relation to decentralized networks. So both regulatory guidance as well as case law have in recent years increasingly expanded the definition of who a data controller is. This started in 2010 when the Article 29 Working Party, which is the predecessor of the European Data Protection Board, issued guidance on the notion of the data controller. And in this guidance, it says that, well, even though the GDPR itself refers to the purposes and the means as two criteria on equal footing, actually the determination of the purposes by itself would always trigger the qualification of a data controller. So this already expands the circle of controllers beyond those that also influence the means. And then there's a line of recent cases decided by the European Court of Justice over the past 2 to 3 years that has contributed to this gradual broadening. So in a case called Wirtschaftsakademie Schleswig-Holstein, the European Court of Justice argued that in order to ensure the complete and effective protection of data subject, we need a broad interpretation of this notion of control. And that, it argued, means that where someone agrees to others' determination of the means, then that is in itself sufficient to be a data controller, where one also pursues a purpose. So, in practice, that means that where you're using a given technology to pursue your own purpose, to pursue your own objective, the means that have been defined by those that have developed the technology, and you don't need to independently exercise control over that. So of course, this again expands the circle of those that qualify as data controllers under the GDPR, and conversely expands the circles of those that need to comply with any and all obligations arising under the GDPR. And then an additional relevant case in this respect is Jehovah's Witnesses case, which was decided by the European Court of Justice shortly after Wirtschaftsakademie Schleswig-Holstein. And in this case, the court held that the natural or legal person that exerts influence over the processing of personal data for his own purposes and who participates as a result in the determination of the purposes and means of that processing may also be regarded as a controller. So it's really clear that the law is moving in a direction where more and more people become liable to comply with data protection law, and this even where they don't exercise control over the means, that is to say, where they don't have any actual control over the technological details of the processing of the data. And this, as you might have guessed already, of course, has very far-reaching implications for blockchain-based decentralized networks. There's been an ongoing discussion in the EU over the past couple of years that debates which actors in blockchain-based decentralized networks might actually qualify as data controllers. And there's no real agreement as to who qualifies as a controller in a given context. And there's sort of most people agree that there's a large variety of actors that might potentially do so. And of course, determining whether someone is a data controller or not in relation to blockchain is not an answer that can be answered, sort of a question that can be answered as such, because of course, blockchain refers to a range of different technologies that have different technical and organizational structures. So in order to really be able to determine who is a data controller in relation to a specific project, you would need to look at the detail of those technical and organizational setups. Now, that said, there will oftentimes be circumstances in which layer 2 applications qualify as data controllers to the extent that they agree to the means of processing that may have been determined by others. And of course, they also pursue their own purposes for processing personal data, which could be a public key in some circumstances. When we look at layer 1s, potential candidates for data controllers include software developers, miners or validators, nodes, users. There's guidance by the French Data Protection Authority, which suggests that a user of the Bitcoin blockchain, which is the example that they gave in their paper, would be a data controller, even in relation to their own personal data, which is an unprecedented suggestion in EU data protection law. And from that, I think we can really distill two core concerns. First of all, you could already see on the basis of what I've just been saying that there really is a lack of legal certainty as to who is the data controller under EU data protection law. This is a general issue, I would say, at this moment in time, but it's one that's particularly pronounced when we talk about blockchain-based decentralized networks. The second consequence is that because of the broad definition of control and because of the fact that even actors that only influence the purposes but not the means of processing, we're in a situation where actors that have no technical ability to exercise the obligations arising under the GDPR may actually be legally required to do so, which I think we can agree is not a desirable state of affairs. Now, I said that this is a general problem, so hopefully there will be more guidance in the future. And it looks like there might also be a specific guidance as to how to apply the GDPR to blockchains from the European Data Protection Board in the near future. I think this is something that many people in the space have been waiting for a couple of years already. So we sort of know that this is something they're working on. So hopefully this will come out soon. So I focused on the GDPR specifically so far, but I think that when we talk about decentralized network governance from a EU data law perspective, we also really need to talk about the Data Governance Act. The Data Governance Act is a legislative proposal that was put forward by the European Commission about 6 months ago. And what the Data Governance Act would do that is particularly relevant for our purposes. It seeks to do a range of different things, but I think that in the context of blockchains, the most significant thing is that it would create a really light touch notification framework for providers of data sharing services. And of course, we know that there's that there's a sort of an emerging industry of data sharing services providers in the EU, and some of those data sharing service providers, in fact, do make use of blockchain. Now, the first thing to say in relation to the Data Governance Act is that I think generally it's really laudable that it's technology agnostic. In many respects. One illustration of this is that it explicitly says that payment for data that is being intermediated by a data sharing service can take any form. So I think it explicitly sort of opens the door for token-based transactions, for instance. But when we look at this from a decentralized network perspective, I think it also really needs to be stressed that the Data Governance Act still requires the existence of a centralized legal entity that is in charge of applying for the notification that can be obtained under the Data Governance Act, and which also needs to ensure legal compliance, among other things, by making sure that data protection law is being respected, as well as other requirements that emerge under EU law, EU data law. And of course, there's a whole range of reasons as to why we want to have the centralized legal entity in this respect, but certainly this is something that will prove problematic for sort of highly decentralized blockchain-based projects, particularly those that are anonymous. And we know that there's more and more of those in areas such as, for instance, decentralized exchanges. So it's also something that we might see over time in relation to data sharing services. So wrapping up, let me share those four thoughts with you. I think that there's no doubt that decentralized data networks can be a beneficial development for the data economy. I think it's a development that can help us increase the sustainability of the usage of data. And when I say sustainability, I really think of the three dimensions of sustainability, so environmental, human, and economic. However, there can also be no doubt that the law currently imposes limits on such decentralization. Again, as I said before, for reasons that are as such beneficial, but it can limit sort of innovation that we are seeing in this space. So what we really need is, I think, more discussions and clarifications, particularly in relation to the concept of the data controller, which is really, I think, a general issue in data protection law, one that is particularly burdening for decentralized projects, and one that has been obvious for many, many years. So when the EDPB guidelines on blockchains will come out, I think the data controller part is something that people will pay particularly attention to. And then, of course, I think that data law also just highlights some of the general legal challenges of organizational innovation that we're seeing in this space. And I'm really glad that today's event is taking place, that we have to discuss some of those other challenges as well. So I'm going to stop here and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for an interesting deep dive on the legal aspects of decentralized network governance. So it's again the perfect segue to move towards our second panel discussion for the day, with a topic of legal and regulatory considerations. So I will give the floor to Inigo More, UBOF expert panel, also expert in payment systems and services, especially to peer-to-peer payments, such as migrants remittances. So Inigo, the floor is yours, and to your distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this very interesting workshop. And thank you also for inviting me, where I will participate as a moderator, as my tie is clearly saying, is surprising that I am the only one here with a tie. Used to be quite a normal thing. So welcome everybody. And our panel is going to discuss about the legal and regulatory considerations regarding the ambience. In the world of blockchain, we tend to think that technology is everything, not only the mechanism that enables, but also the one that sets the limits. But well, as our colleague Michelle has told us, there is data protection regulations that maybe need to be considered. Also, regarding some applications of the activities in this universe, we may also find that maybe anti-money laundering regulations are relevant. Maybe payments regulations like PSD2 are relevant. We are all of us aware that there is a new regulation called MiCA that is going to regulate the market on crypto assets. And of course, there are initiatives not only from the technology above, but from the top down that are trying to set maybe limits, or maybe we should take it into consideration. So our panel is going to take a round view of all of that, and we will start with our colleague from Italy, Signore Pietro Marchioni, which is the coordinator of infrastructure and technology of the European Blockchain Partnership. We will continue with our colleague from Portugal, Senor Antonio Garcia Rolo, which is now with the Lisbon Center of Research in Private Law in the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon. We will have Professor André Sweeter, which is the Dean of Campus Grisland in Groningen, Netherlands. And finally, Joshua Tan, that has experienced some issues connecting with us, but well, I see that he resolved all of those troubles, and finally he is with us. So we will start in this order with Signore Pietro Marchioni, if I say it, the name well, because my Italian is not so good, which is an expert in digital transformation of complex organizations. You have to read here like supranational and national organizations, states, not only in what regards Italy and the Italian public administration, but as far away as the Middle East. He helped United Arab Emirates starting the project called Smart Dubai, and well, finally the European Union as a whole through an initiative that is worth mentioning here, which is called the European Blockchain Partnership. So, Mr. Marchioni, my first question: what is the European Blockchain Partnership, and what is your role in the EBP?
Thank you very much, and your pronunciation is very good. Thanks. So the partnership is a joint effort from all the member states of the European Union, plus other states they are joining, and they join and they will be joining in future, to create a cross-border blockchain infrastructure that will support many of the services that we were discussing today, and we were having somehow trouble today to deal with whenever these services are running on a public infrastructure. Public means anonymous, means open like the Ethereum and the others. So the idea was to create something that has been called an European Blockchain Service Infrastructure, of which I'm the coordinator, whose aim is to set up a common environment for cross-border services to run. Means if I'm Italian citizen, I want to go in France and I want to consume a service, provide, for example, my digital identity, I would be able to do it easily through blockchain technology, thanks to this infrastructure.
Allow me a further question, maybe more technical and more complicated, which is the following. How the European blockchain partnership is, trying to do this? What is the exact mechanism and, how the average user or maybe interested party can see you in motion? How?
Yes. So we created some groups that were focusing on what we call core areas or core services of the infrastructure, as we understood that we analyzed the evolution of the blockchain ecosystem, focusing naturally on public administration, because the first step for us was public administration, public services. So the idea has been to set up some focus groups, some groups that would focus on specific areas. So the group I'm coordinating is focusing on the bare technology, so infrastructure and some core services that need to be given, so take available to third parties in order to allow such third parties to operate into the infrastructure. Then we decided that there were one of the most important use cases is to set up the European self-sovereign entity framework. So a framework that would allow European citizens to enjoy their identity in a self-sovereign, with a self-sovereign approach. And then other use cases as the diploma use case that wants to simplify the cross-border sharing of qualification for students. We have the European Social Security number that aims to have a unique social security number for the citizen going through Europe. For example, we have a German citizen that lives and works in France, whether for a German company or for a French company, and so forth. So the idea, the bare idea, is to set up many services that help Europe to become a single entity at the end. So a more unified, digitally speaking, but digitally means also practically speaking for citizens, entity.
I am glad to have an Italian in charge of that because, it was Italy, the country that created the first centralized version of all Europe. And I remember the classic Roman Republic. So I am sure that your efforts are going to bear fruit. Let's stay here and we will continue with further questions, maybe from the public, after all your colleagues are properly introduced. Thank you very much, Signor Marchioni.
You're welcome.
Follows Senor Rollo, which is an expert in private law and comes, as I told you, from Portugal. And as an expert in private law, maybe he can enlighten us in a matter which is apparently simple, but maybe not that much. All legal experts divide the world into public law, private law. Public is where the state, etc., has something to do. Private is the will of the parties that intervene, like in a contract. So a short question just to start, Senor Rollo. Do you think that blockchain belongs to what we call private law, like contracts, or not?
Thank you very much for the interesting question. And as you said, it's not as simple. It doesn't have a simple answer. And sometimes the discussion is itself sometimes misframed because, well, a given blockchain is, after all, a public ledger that allows one to assess ownership of certain assets that are based or deployed upon that blockchain, as well as to validate transactions. So basically, it assesses voluntary changes in ownership as well. So in that regard, a blockchain is not that different from other registries or from other ledgers, the traditional registries or ledgers. I'm talking about publicly operated registries such as land registries or commercial registries, or even privately operated registries such as the internal share ledger that many companies have. In the case of the former, so the publicly owned ledgers, they are governed by public law. So the land registry itself is governed by public law, for instance, but the facts that they register are private law facts. So for instance, if I sell you a house and I have to register, it's a contract. So it's a private law fact that it's registered upon a public ledger or the establishment of the company, for instance. In the case of the latter, so for instance, privately operated registries, many companies, in Portugal, I know it's like this, and I think it's fairly common among other European countries, that non-listed companies have a private share ledger in which they register changes in ownership. So that's a privately operated ledger that naturally registers a private law fact, which is the change in the ownership of a share. So therefore, from a material perspective, so if one takes into account the facts that are assessed by the ledger itself, I would say that, well, most of the blockchains or other DLTs would generally belong in private law, since they are a mechanism to assess ownership of mostly private law products, without prejudice, of course, to the fact of using blockchain to assess public law facts, which is possible, and it's already been referred to. From a governance perspective, well, I would say that generally, of course, let me put this caveat, emphasize the caveat of generally, because, well, we all know that things are not that simple, but generally public or permissionless blockchains with their completely decentralized structures, well, they would not exactly be privately managed on one hand, but they are far from publicly managed. So I would say in that sense, private law, while the permission or private blockchains, well, that would depend on who is governing them. So if it's governed by public body, they wouldn't be as much different from a land registry or commercial registry. If they are governed by a private body, well, that would be the same as, for instance, a share ledger in a company.
Okay, this is an incredible opportunity to have a lawyer answering our questions, because you can enlighten us in a way that otherwise will be incredibly expensive for us. So I will make you a deep, serious, and maybe a technical question that is, from my point of view, critical in the field that we are discussing, which is, from your perspective, what is the legal status of the decentralized autonomous organizations, and what issues should be addressed when regulating them?
Well, that is indeed a very it's not a simple question, but a simple answer. First of all, of course, it depends on how do we define DAO, because, well, DAOs, well, one can see it out from a very broad perspective that would include many blockchains, for instance. I would tend to use, at least for the immediate effects of this analysis, a narrow definition. So in the way of a smart contract, conceptualized as a relatively autonomous and self-sufficient organization, usually jointly held by token holders that provide funding and that share directly or indirectly in its earnings, even though specific DAOs might drop one of these characteristics and adopt others. So I am fully aware of this definition that I've just given. In any case, for the purposes of legal qualification, the idea of autonomy and self-sufficiency must always be kept in mind, because indeed a DAO, and that was the whole purpose of when Vitalik Buterin first proposed the definition in 2014, when the infamous 2016 DAO started and then went south. Well, a DAO is supposed to work without managers or employees taking decisions centrally. So the idea is to operate mostly automatically and through the code in order to address the agency problem and the moral hazards associated therewith by discarding delegated management. So let's get rid of management altogether and let's find alternative decentralized ways of managing an organization. As Vitalik Buterin himself put it in 2014, the automaton is at the center and the humans are at the edges. So even though DAOs are sometimes described as crypto companies, In most jurisdictions, they would not be qualified as incorporated companies. Well, first of all, because many or most are not even registered as such, but rather as unincorporated partnerships in the common law and what we call in civil law, civil societies. I'm translating literally from the French Société Civile or the Portuguese Sociedade Civil and so forth. So in most jurisdictions, the qualification of a certain set of human relationships as such of an incorporated partnership is the result of two or more people pooling assets together with a joint purpose to carry out some activity, collectively deciding on the fate of such assets and receiving some kind of reward or some kind of earnings therefrom. So it's a very broad definitions, and I would say most DAOs would probably fulfill these extremely broad prerequisites. But in most cases, in all jurisdictions that I know of, the unincorporated partnership would have legal personality and therefore would not enjoy entity shielding. So the members would be jointly and severally liable for any debts or any damage arising from the activity. And this, of course, is a highly undesirable situation, and it's, at least I personally don't believe it to be tenable, though it can work as an interim legal solution. Because, well, partnership law was actually designed to provide flexible and safe solutions to small business owners and not to blockchain-based operations that spread across borders with a large number of members. So what can be done from a regulatory and legislative perspective? Well, first of all, to simply allow DAOs to register as normal companies presents a big obstacle, because while the bestowment of legal personality and limited liability is not a problem per se, most jurisdictions would require corporate forms with both such characteristics to have mandatory delegated management, so to have the traditional corporate structure of shareholders and managers, which is anathema to the whole idea of DAOs. So such requirement would have to be discarded, at least for DAOs. In what concerns legal personality and the consequent limited liability, well, that would of course protect the members or token holders, and in most jurisdictions, legal personality grants the constituents of a legal person shielding from the legal person's creditors, thereby granting legal security to the activity. And also, important thing, it gives the possibility of the legal person to be a party to contracts autonomously without needing a specific representative, as many DAOs usually, as described in the other panel, usually use a foundation, a representative, even a company, to act on their behalf to the outside world. However, state authorities usually demand the trade-off. So the state grants or recognizes legal personality and limited liability if the beneficiary registers in some kind of public record, such as a commercial registry, and discloses some basic information. Some market actors might be reluctant to do so, but it's a much less intrusive requirement than requiring mandatory delegated management, and likely a necessary one. As such, any recognition of DAOs as legal persons with a degree of limited liability would have to solve this fundamental problem. So to allow legal personality and limited liability, which would require registry, but without requiring fixed or traditional management structures. And this seems to be the way that some jurisdictions are starting to approach DAOs. In the past years, the US states of Vermont and Wyoming have explicitly foreseen the regulation of DAOs in their statutes. So in Vermont, now we have the possibility of incorporating a blockchain-based LLC, and in Wyoming, we have the possibility of establishing a DAO LLC. And both laws are very similar. So basically, they recognize such DAOs as a special type of limited liability companies, thereby having legal personality and limited liability, but they do not intrude forcefully in the management or require a delegated management at all times. So they allow the inclusion of smart contracts in governance and also leave the assessment of membership largely to the articles of organization or operating agreements. So this opens the door to assess membership through a given blockchain. So basically, to conclude, the trade-off for legal personality and limited liability is, of course, registration and subjection to some minimum rules. And it seems to be a fair compromise that avoids that DAOs registered in those states live dangerously as partnerships and gives some legal benefits of the corporate form without requiring a heavy-handed intervention. Of course, that many other problems remain unaddressed, such as representation, applicable law, corporate purpose, money laundering issues, taxes, of course, criminal liability, but we still have a long path to trod. But I think that at least the approach that was adopted in Vermont and Wyoming is an interesting start, and at least it solves the fundamental problem of allowing DAOs to exist with limited liability and legal personality without forcing membership requirements and management requirements upon them. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Senor Antonio Garcia Rolo. I have taken note that as a legal consideration, I have to pay attention to corporate structure, to legal personality, to limited liability, and let's hope that regulators understand this and enable us in this universe to go this path. Thank you very much. We will continue the conversation. I am sure that there are many questions for such a bright lawyer. And let's go to the next participant, which is Andrei Suiter. I am sorry if my pronunciation of Dutch is not that good. I hope you might forgive us. Mr. Suiter is an academic, of course, very brilliant with PhD, etc. Well, most of us, we have PhDs. The problem is that very few have written so beautiful papers like Mr. Suiter. I have here with me a copy of Decentralized Network Governance, Blockchain Technology and the Future of Regulation that I recommend you all because it is a very good paper, but of course it is also available in the internet for free, which is a rarity, where Mr. Suiter explains us his point of view, theorizing about, of course, decentralized networks. But the first thing that comes to my mind is that Mr. Suiter, or Dr. Suiter, that a part of the time is theorizing on decentralized organization, spends the other part of his time managing a very centralized organization because he is the dean in Groningen University. And this is like a strong contrast. What can you tell us about this experience of being in both ends, centralized, decentralized?
So thank you very much for a very generous introduction. You put the finger on a very sore spot, right? We have traditional modes of governance. They tend to be very hierarchical. They tend to be top-down, and we see that both at the faculty level, where the dean is in charge, as well as within the state, right, where the state is in charge, and members of the state look up to the state for making regulations. And even if we look at less traditional models, network governance models, for example, where we find public-private partnerships and semi-autonomous regulation, we still see that the state gives a derived right, so to speak, to these actors to make their own regulations. In other words, there is still the shadow of the state that is there. And what we see in upcoming models of governance, specifically when we look at decentralized network governance, as in the paper that you just so kindly shared, we realize that more and more that in these traditional or more traditional forms of governance, the roles need to be very clearly defined, right? Who is the regulator? Who are the regulated? What are the rights? What are the obligations? And if this is clear, then functioning can only be preserved if there's also trust in the regulator that the regulator does a good job, and the other way around. There needs to be some trust in the subjects of regulation that they will abide by the regulation. Now, in contrast to that, and that is really fascinating, when we look at decentralized network governance, we see that the roles that actors within these networks take, they tend to shift, and it becomes even more complex when we look at a combination between on-chain governance and off-chain governance that very often very strongly interact. Now, when we have such changing roles, and in addition to that, we have an automated and trustless, a trustless system of DLT-based solutions, we find that the previous requirement of trust falls away, but that has also implications. And the implications are, on the one hand, it can be an advantage because, you know, transparency is very good when it comes to checking whether the regulator does his job. But it also means that the legitimacy that is usually attached to this concept of trust is also not necessarily present. And we see these direct effects even with the examples that Professor Werbach also mentioned, where an interest in voting within DAOs might not even be given because there is a lack of a buy-in and a concrete interest in doing so. So to find a good bridge between the two, that is really a challenge.
I cannot resist continuing exploring this situation where decentralized and centralized live together, which is your position. So what can centralized learn from decentralized? Is it possible to live together, or is it one or the other? Maybe the future of the university is decentralized because it cannot assume, or maybe university can assume this kind of instruments. How do you see this route?
If you allow me, I go away from the example of universities, but very concretely to decentralized governance. One thing was mentioned today was code is law. In essence, if you implement decentralized and decentralized ledger technology, you are implementing a governance structure. Second of all, parallel to that, and that was mentioned by Mario already, we have also off-chain governance. So governance that happens outside the blockchain and that is informed not only by the participants in the DLT solution, but that is also informed by laws, regulations, contracts, and other soft laws that might be applicable. So in essence, what that means is that the code that you generate, the law that you generate, the legal structures that you generate within the software, the digital ledger technology, has implications on the off-chain governance and vice versa. So the biggest challenge that we really face is how to integrate the both. And it happens very rarely, with the exception, of course, of Antonio, that lawyers are familiar with blockchain technology or blockchain developers are familiar with the law. And it's an emergent area where we see now increasing expertise developing, but there are still problems, and Xian has really put it very much to the point with a somewhat pessimistic outlook. We see a lot of blockchain initiatives moving away from the regulated space or embracing the regulated space. And I'm in the lucky position that I'm on the advisory board of the Dusk Network, which focuses both on regulation and the regulatability of the blockchain technology that they are developing, but at the same time on privacy preservance. And there we have really the whole concept of the trustlessness with the privacy component coming in. And so the key challenge here is, how do we preserve the advances that we've made with blockchain technology while abiding to the necessities that the state still has to regulate the finance sector and other sectors, contracts, and so forth. So we cannot let go completely, but we need to see how we marry those two domains the best.
Thank you very much. My takeaway is that the biggest challenge is how to integrate both perspectives, how to preserve the advantages of blockchain and abide with the law that, of course, is mandatory, and we cannot escape. We will continue discussing about this, and I would want to say welcome, very warm welcome to Joshua Tan that has experienced a lot of trouble connecting. I hope that he is now online. Hello, Joshua, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome. So let's go straight to the point. Among many other things, of course, in very relevant universities, you run a site called meta-governance. Could you define the term meta-governance in one sentence?
In one sentence. I'll do my best. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really, truly an honor to be here with such distinguished moderator and other panelists. Meta-governance, the way we define it as part of the project is, there's really two definitions. First is, let's say, tools and infrastructure that sort of make governance possible. So I remember AJ was just talking about the term regulability, right? So exactly the kind of infrastructure that makes certain things regulable. And in the case of online platforms like the blockchain, that means the code. But also, we also think about it in the sense of governance is often defined in terms, or, it's implemented through many different institutions. There's, of course, the underlying sort of like, say, blockchain infrastructure with the DAO, but of course there's the foundation, there's various legal frameworks, there's when you go to these online communities, and that's really my expertise, there's many, many different platforms that people communicate and sort of actually organize within. So things like Discord, Telegram, Lumio, many, many others. And we think of these institutions as interacting with each other. And that pattern of interaction, we also sort of think of as meta-governance, because each of these institutions are sort of governing institutions, but meta is where they sort of start to interact.
Okay, for anybody interested in the subject, there is a very nice website on metagov.org where you can find further information about the project and about what it's doing. I repeat, metagov.org, which I recommend to you all because it is very interesting. So let me go, Joshua, to a more detailed and elaborated question, which deals with self-governance, which is the origin or the aim of our blockchain, which is self-governance. Is it a right or is it an aspiration? Because not always we manage, right, to go in this sense. Is it good or is it bad? I mean, how can we ensure that users can self-govern themselves in this universe of blockchain where we spend a part of our time, at least?
I was just, okay, I guess the short answer is that it's, at this point, very much an aspiration. If you look at the state of current blockchain projects, or just really the history of the, how to say it, the ugly history of democracy on the internet, or these, half-attempted attempts to sort of implement democracy on the internet, it's still very much an aspiration. However, maybe I'll just point to those of you who are interested in this question. There was like an article by a colleague of mine, Raf Koster, who was the one of the original designers of a game called Ultima Online. I don't know if you guys were around when this was, popular, but this was what's called an MMO for massively multiplayer online game. And Raf wrote a really provocative piece, which was all around, I think, back in the days when people were studying democracy in the context of online games as opposed to blockchains. It was called Declaring the Rights of Avatars. So I'll kind of just summarize the sort of like the TLDR of this piece, but essentially, what he's saying is that, so I can sort of have these human declarations of rights, or rights to self-governance. I can pose questions, pose this notion of self-governance online as a right, And people kind of really resist this, actually, especially like centralized operators of, of those old games. But, even today, I think, when I interface with, the CEOs of, blockchain projects, they're often sometimes quite leery of this, passing off control to users. And it's a process they try to make take a lot of effort to put guardrails around, right? To sort of devolve power or exit community in a kind of safe way that preserves the project structure. But sort of like the underlying thesis of Raf's article here is that actually, if you take a rights-based approach versus, and you could declare this in a kind of like rights-based language, versus if you just if you say all the same things, but you just speak about it in a kind of in terms of like a user experience, or just in terms of like, what are sort of good operating principles for building a successful online project that has, like user excitement or user backing? They're actually pretty much the same thing. So you can kind of choose whether, whether it's how do I say it? It's a right or maybe it's an aspiration. And they're really just two ways of articulating the same thing. And in practice, they're actually quite related if you're like thinking about how to implement this. I'm not sure if that was a successful answer to that question.
Oh, yes, of course. Very enlightening and pretty interesting to have this point of view. I believe that we do not have much time. Maybe the organizers will allow us for a further questions. What do you think, Yanis? Are we good or not?
Yeah, I think we're 6 minutes over time. So in order for the other, let's say, participants to be able to give their presentations on time, and also maybe some also of the audience wants to join at a specific point in time, I would suggest we wrap this up, and yeah, we can continue, let's say, discussions in the form of the Q&A session offline.
Okay, so we will continue offline.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inigo, for a great panel discussion. Some interesting topics were discussed between your distinguished panelists. And let's now move towards the last session for today's webinar, which is about notable decentralized applications based on DAOs or similar structures. And we will kick this session off with Professor Samer Hassan, Faculty Associate, Beckman Klein Center, Harvard University, Associate Professor of University Complutense de Madrid. So, Professor Samer Hassan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So, let me see. I assume that you can see the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So I would like to talk about DAOs, but taking a step back to give introduction to more practical case studies. So I don't need to explain this in this audience. We are used to traditional organizations, which are typically hierarchical, rigid. And the internet, way before blockchain, enabled new organization structures, our famous online communities that are typically open, not as closed as our traditional enterprises or corporations. Instead of having a command control hierarchies, they have fluid and flat hierarchies. They are more flexible, dynamic, and to some extent, they are pretty decentralized. The distribution of participation or the distribution of work, it's far from equal. So we have a 1% of we call creators, we have a 9% of occasional contributors, and a 90% of audience that somehow belong to the community, but are not doing the work, let's say, right? Or maybe they are talking about it, maybe they are disseminating about it, or just using it, depending on the community that we are talking about. So we can think of many communities I am focusing beyond finance in this presentation. So I'm talking more about communities trying to do work, collaborating together, thinking of Wikipedia, open source software, but Stack Overflow or GitHub that we are used to seeing nowadays. But we can also talk about decentralized enterprises, and DAOs are not the first ones doing that. We already have models where attempts of doing flat hierarchies or manager-less enterprises like Valve, the creator of Steam for video games, or in Spiral, that here we can see their organizational chart and how it's far from what we would understand a traditional company is, right? So we are already seeing experimentation there. And yet, of course, blockchain enabled new organizational structures again. So we have the DAOs that Mario in the beginning provided an overview, but I would like to get a bit more in detail there. So the same as all the audience in this presentation, if we wanted to create a legal organization, we could just agree on some bylaws, and the bylaws would determine and define this, mediate somehow the interactions between all of us. So the bylaws would define if there is an assembly where we get together, or how do we take decisions, if there are some representatives that we choose, or how we would interact with each other, how we would take decisions. So in the same way, we can encode these bylaws in code. If we do that and deploy this code onto the blockchain, we have these decentralized autonomous organizations. So I mean, there is an overlap, and it's good that we have had some panels on regulation, because this is still a controversial and an open debate on many issues, how law clashes or not with DAOs. But in a traditional legal organization, if there is an online server, an online service, those are centralized, there are managers, there are hierarchies. In DAOs, we are talking about serverless structures, we have encoded rules, and we have, of course, tokenization. These not only, they don't only try to mimic legal organizations somehow, but also traditional platforms providing a service. Typically, when we use a platform in our platform economy today, we have a community, one global community mediated by the software that we are using. We have some generalized rules, like in the case of Airbnb, that regardless if I'm in Bolivia, in Spain, or in Japan, we have the same rules, the same interface. The Airbnb locks users within the platforms because they control the user data, they control the reputation, they control the listings of houses. So if a new startup wants to, let's say, try to compete with them, well, the barrier for competition is very, very high, because there is no way that even if they attract a few houses, people will keep going to Airbnb, right? The centralized internet that we enjoy today is creating de facto monopolies. So even if theoretically any new company can compete with them, it's in practice pretty difficult to do so. The ecosystem that DAOs are creating are pretty much other rules of the game. We are talking about an ecosystem in which we can have, as long as they share nowadays the same network, the same blockchain, we can have, they can share user base where the users can join one DAO or another very easily. They can even hold the reputation and use it across DAOs. We could have easily listings that are shared across DAOs. We can have DAOs that, for example, offer a very anonymous Airbnb service, but others that have an insurance, a proper insurance. So if you don't trust this peer-to-peer economy, and suddenly you don't find your house when you arrive with your suitcases, they give you another one, or they gave you a payment, or stuff like that. We could have DAO BNBs customizing the rules for certain local regions. We could have an ecosystem which doesn't lock as much the users. Of course, we can have multiple differences across them, but it's still they can be composable or interoperable, as the Defy panel has been talking about. Here, I'm talking about how we can see the DAOs evolving pretty soon. We have multiple governance models. Governance, as Mario said, it goes beyond decision making, and yet, if we focus on decision making, we can see how Wikipedia mimics a democratic representation, like in our Western states we would enjoy. In Linux, we have different layers. In Stack Overflow, we have a reputation mechanism that gives you more permissions, the more points you earn. In platform co-ops that are emerging nowadays, we have more traditional co-ops adapted to the platforms. So we already have these things without blockchain. But blockchain is trying to emulate somehow an experiment with multiple governance models as well. So we could have a majority voting, like some DAOs use, like a traditional 51%. The only thing is it's a plutocracy, not a democracy, like Mario said in the beginning, which means that we are not talking about one vote, one person, we're talking about one token, one vote. And yet we can see 51% voting, like if the 51% of tokens agree, it passes or it doesn't. But we can, this scales badly, so we have holographic consensus governance models, which try to build a filter for facilitating relative majorities instead of traditional majority, 51% majorities with a prediction market and so on. I will not get into detail, but anyone feel free to ask. We have conviction voting that One Hive is trying to promote, which instead of having a Brexit vote that Cyan, if I'm pronouncing correctly, was scared about to have the direct democracy, but as Brexit proved it right, well, we could have a model of governance in which the preference is not expressed just in one point in time, just punctually, but continuously. So you can pull back at any time your vote. And the more time you keep it, the more the conviction is growing in this proposal that is being moved forward. Or we could have models like Dandelion voting in Moloch DAOs, like in which they mimicking the right to fork that we see in free open source software. You can just leave. You have the right of rage quitting. Oh, I don't like the decisions that are being taken, so I leave very angry with you all. But this feature facilitating rage quitting promotes consensus, because people don't want to make decisions that would push a big percentage of the community to just rage quit. So these are decentralized governance models that DAOs are enabling, that we are just experimenting with, because it's true, DAOs is a very early immature field, and yet it's a beautiful box for us to experiment. So is this all science fiction? Is this all happening in practice or not? Or, well, we do have a lot of things beyond finance, of course, although of course Defy has pushed the field a lot. So Aragon is claiming to have many hundreds of millions of dollars in assets stored directly in their DAOs. Aragon is a DAO platform with 1,700 is the last figure of organizations created. The number of DAOs is exponentially increasing. We are seeing news about 1 billion DAOs are managed by DAOs. Others are saying $3 billion. $3 billion. Going to, I mean, there are a lot of people talking about it. It's, of course, the hype blew up, but still we see inflation of expectations in some areas. So we try to research about it. From me and my team, we have the peer-to-peer models project from the European Research Council, but also co-led by Javier Arroyo, we have some support from the Spanish Ministry of Science to do data-driven research in what's going on. So from a more theoretical social science perspective, we're trying to contribute with definitions, analyzing the potentials, like Kevin was mentioning, Elinor Ostrom Nobel Prize in economics. We have taken her governance framework and applied it to blockchain DAOs, explore how can we use blockchain for commons-oriented collaborative communities. We have explored how practical institutions are applying blockchain nowadays, like Estonia, and what's the difference between the propaganda and the actual use cases implemented. We are also developing software because we are a very interdisciplinary group, and we have developed wikis in DAOs, like trying to prove that we can collaborate using DAOs. We have implemented some committees for Aragon. We are working with existing collaborative communities like Amara, that is the largest online community for creation of subtitles. For example, subtitling the TED Talks that I'm sure you have heard about. So we are working with them to help them decentralize their governance, helping them use blockchain to lose their control over the large communities that are working on the platform. We are working with Smart, the largest European cooperative, again, trying to co-design pilots with them. We are doing some experimentation, of course, with these pilots, and building dashboards for observing the evolution of DAOs or other online communities. And we are focusing on as well on data science of these ecosystems. So we are exploring the Aragon, DAO Stack, DAO House, how these communities are evolving. How is the ecosystem evolving? Are there these fashionable governance models? Do they work? Well, we have a paper testing the holographic consensus, and we see that it seems that it is doing, at least preliminary research shows that it seems it's doing what it is meant to do, that is facilitating the scalability of these online communities. We're exploring also how their activity fluctuates, for example, with surges of the cost of participation. So the gas, like users need to pay in order to participate, which creates new frictions in these governance models. So what happens when suddenly in this very unstable context of cryptocurrencies, we have surges of the price? Does it affect the activity of the DAOs? Does it seems that they are not being affected, which would follow that they are not behaving like a market, which is very interesting and needs further research. And also we are trying to see, okay, but what's happening today in practice? So we were hired by the European Commission to do this report on scanning the European ecosystem of DLTs for social good. So the blockchain ecosystem for social good. We trying to remove the, let's say, the bullshit and vaporware and multiple projects that are not, that don't have real users. So we try to do a mapping of the ecosystem. 130 projects, statistical analysis, we showcased 10 that we interviewed, and you have a very interesting report published by the European Commission online available. And until here, thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you, Samir, for an excellent presentation, a different view and approach of DAOs. That was really insightful. And moving forward to our next speaker for today, the next speaker is Federico Ast, founder and CEO of Kleros. Nice to see a Greek word. Here, a legal tech company using game theory and blockchain technology in arbitration. So Federico, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can I share my screen? 1 second. Yeah, well, can you see the screen?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's very exciting to see so many people interested in DAOs and this new future of organizations. And let me tell you a bit about Kleros, which is a DAO actually. It's born out of a problem which exists in the Web3 ecosystem. You know, we have people building all kinds of apps, decentralized applications, right? In order to reconstruct, as Samer was saying, some of the old platforms that we have today. There is a problem here that smart contracts, they are great at self-executing, but they are incomplete in the sense that sometimes you require some human intervention to resolve situations that might happen in these organizations, right? Like smart contracts are smart enough to self-execute, but they are not smart enough to resolve subjective situations. This is kind of the situations that typically in the offline world are solved by, you know, legal systems or courts. So let's imagine that, you know, Alice hires Bob to build, let's say, a software for her, like a website, and well, they agree on what are the conditions and some contract, and they do this through a smart contract. And well, in this case, so Alice will make a deposit in Ether into a smart contract that will hold the funds into an escrow. And then they both agree that if there is a dispute in this contract, maybe because Bob didn't do as many buttons or the website is not as nice as she expected, so they both agree voluntarily that they are going to use an arbitrator called Kleros, right? And Kleros, let's say the dispute starts, and so the funds will stay locked into that smart contract, and Kleros is going to select a jury of experts and people who are going to analyze the evidence, are going to analyze the contract that was done by the parties, are going to analyze the product that was delivered, and then they are going to, each of them independently vote on who is right on this dispute. So a very important thing here is that Kleros is a DAO, right? Everything on how Kleros will work, how evidence will be treated, how jurors are going to be selected is coded into the DAO code. No one can tamper with this, right? There is no like special console key that can be used by founders or by anyone else to, you know, change how jurors are selected or how evidence is treated. So this gives both parties the guarantee that everything is going to happen exactly as it was coded in the first place, right? So this kind of gives everyone who participates in this scheme a semblance of like what we call rule of law, you know, and procedural fairness, right? So these jurors are going to analyze the evidence and they're going to vote. And in this case, they will vote that Alice was right. So the money that was held into the escrow is going to be sent to Alice, and this ends the dispute, right? And so this is how Kleros can solve this subjective situation that happened between these parties, you know, because one claimed that the website was not good enough, the other that it was. So smart contracts cannot really solve this by their own, because this requires some, you know, human consideration of the product, and there are some things that the code itself cannot self-execute. So, of course, you might be asking, well, how are these jurors selected, right? Imagine we have this woman, she's a designer in, you know, Vietnam, and she has a job as a designer, and she wants to make some extra money on the side by being a juror on website disputes happening in Kleros. So in order to be drawn as a juror, you need to get this token called PNK. It comes from Pinakion. So Ioannis will be happy to learn that this is very much inspired by how ancient the Athenian courts used to work. So the Athenians had you remember that they had these popular trials where all citizens could participate. And they had a very specific way to select jurors. They had an ID called Pinakion, and they had to insert this ID into a machine called Kleroterion. And it was like a randomization device, right? So, so this enabled a selection of jurors that was transparent, that was, no one could tamper with the selection of jurors. So this kind of Kleros is loosely inspired on how ancient Athenian courts used to work. So this ticket, this PNK token is kind of lottery ticket that gives you the right to be drawn as a juror in disputes happening in Kleros. Kleros is a general court system that can handle a lot of different cases. In this case, so the juror will deposit the token into the court where she wants to work, which is the website court. So lots of people will deposit this token, and some of them are going to be drawn, and they're going to be drawn as jurors in order to solve this dispute. Maybe in this case it's 5, sometimes it's 3, or it could be more. So, and these guys are going to be able to vote on who is right or wrong, so these are going to decide who is the winner of the dispute. I'm not going to go through here, because in how the incentives work, because I just was given 15 minutes and there's not enough time. So there is a lot of game theory involved in how this token has a number of use cases to prevent civil attacks and to provide the incentives of for jurors to behave honestly and to consider the evidence and all that. It's based on Schelling points. So in a nutshell, what happens here is that jurors need to try to understand or figure out how the majority of the jurors are going to vote on this case, and they are rewarded if they vote similar to the majority, and they are penalized if they vote different from the majority, right? So I'm not going to get into this now, but there are tons of videos of me speaking about this on YouTube. But this is kind of how the game theory makes sure that the individual interest of each juror is aligned with them producing the right, the fair decision for the dispute. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice, right? In March 2019, we launched an app which was based in using Kleros jurors to analyze tokens and how, we live in this crypto ecosystem, and lots of people they create tokens and they want their tokens to be listed into different exchanges, right? In order to sell them. So we have this very big exchange called Uniswap, where people were starting to make fake tokens and have them listed on Uniswap, tokens which impersonated real tokens in order to have others buy them, and basically they were scams. So this Uniswap wanting to be a DAO, so this creates an interesting problem, of governance, because Uniswap is a DAO, then it shouldn't have an internal team vetting tokens that are going to be listed, because that would not be decentralized. But on the other hand, if no one vets these tokens, so a lot of scam tokens are going to make it into the exchange, and they're going to potentially make people lose money. So how can one build a decentralized token compliance procedure that is based on the community, that doesn't imply introducing a single point of failure, right? So at Kleros, we developed this app called Tokens, and that you can see here, where anyone could send potentially a token to be listed, and tokens that make it into the list are seen as are regarded as safe tokens, right? So this is how it works. Let's say Alice makes a token and she wants to submit the token to be listed into an exchange, and let's Uniswap. So she has to make a submission and then make a deposit, and then this is the form that she has to send, with the name of the token, the contract address, and all that. And this stays visible for a while for all of the community members. They can check the submission, and if no one thinks that there's a problem here, so if they think that the token complies with the guidelines, they just do nothing, and the token gets listed, and she gets back the deposit. But let's say that now she makes a fake token, and she submits this. Other users can analyze this, and let's say someone thinks that it doesn't comply with the rules because it's a fake or it's a scam, so they can challenge it by also making a deposit. Let's say that this guy thinks that this token doesn't comply with the rules, so can make a deposit, and there's a challenge, and now there's a dispute between Alice, who says the token complies, and Bob, who says it doesn't comply. Guess what happens? So of course there's going to be a jury at Kleros who are going to analyze the token, they're going to analyze the rules to be listed, and they're going to vote who is right. In this case, they vote that Bob was right, so the token is removed from the list, and Bob gets Alice's deposit, right? Just one example for you to see how it works. Now, Butterchain was a token that was submitted into the list, and people started to analyze it, and they figure out that this Scott Bingley, the CTO, apparently he didn't have like lots of public persona, like public talks, or for a CTO of an important project. So someone, and they, in the white paper, it said something that Scott Bingley was part of the Oxford blockchain group. So someone called Oxford to ask for Scott Bingley, and they answered, we don't know who Scott Bingley is, and we have never heard of some blockchain group here at Oxford. So in the end, it was like a fake social media profile, and it was a fake project, so it was removed from the list. And it happened like 8 months later. The Chinese police started with a number of arrests at a project called Butterchain that was the same that was removed from the Kleros list. And see like how many people got scammed in these 8 months until the Chinese police figured out what was going on and stopped it, right? So this is a good way to show how Kleros or a DAO like Kleros can work as a machine for self-regulation of the crypto ecosystem, right? Uniswap some time ago introduced a number of lists in order for people to choose which tokens they want to see, and one of the lists that they use is a list curated by Kleros. So this is a really interesting case. As I was saying, how can governments regulate this growing, crypto ecosystem where thousands of tokens are made every day? Well, why can't we partner with public regulators and a private regulator like Kleros that can help identify bad actors in the ecosystem, and then with some kind of partnership with traditional governments? Just 2 more things and I end. This was an example of how can Kleros help secure a DAO like Uniswap. Kleros is also used, prediction markets. Omen is a prediction market where people can, bet on different outcomes of different events. So there was one, and Omen is connected to Kleros. So if there is a dispute about the market in Omen, it's solved by Kleros. So there was one very famous case where some market in Omen was required, so asked, will there be a day with at least 1,000 reported corona deaths in the US in the first 14 days of July? So some of the sources said that there was one day with more than 1,000. The others said that no. So that was a dispute, like what number is the correct one to clear the prediction markets that were done on this. So that's another example of how a DAO like Omen can connect to another DAO like Kleros for solving some of its governance problems. And the final case I want to show you is, we have all these DAOs creating new governance. So as Samer was explaining, the different governance systems and different voting systems. So what happens if some proposal is made at one of these DAOs that basically contradicts a very, core or fundamental beliefs of members of the community, right? So you could potentially use a kind of Kleros use case as a Supreme Court that the community can use. Let's say someone presents a proposal for voting in a DAO that doesn't comply with let's call it the DAO constitution, right? Which states some fundamental beliefs of what the members want the DAO to be. So you could use Kleros to rule out proposals that basically are contradictory to what this DAO constitution thinks. So that's another case where, Kleros is, as a DAO, provides a service to another DAO. And the model of what we are building is what we call like justice as a service. So you can have like lots of different organizations. Well, Samer was presenting before, like the decentralized Airbnb, decentralized exchanges, decentralized prediction markets. They can just use Kleros. They can plug into Kleros and send the problems they have, the cases they have. And then Kleros, through this game theory mechanism that has developed, can send back a decision, and then this decision is enforced in the original platform. So that's how we see Kleros as a DAO producing what we call a governance as a service, of justice as a service, for all of the decentralized ecosystem that is popping, and it's going to be, I think, in the future, a very, very important governance solution for all of crypto. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, happy to answer later.
Thank you, Federico, for an interesting presentation and walk through on how, let's say, even justice and the Supreme Court can be decentralized and offered as a service to the community. And we'll move forward now to our next presentation from Ajit Tripathi from AAVE. So Ajit, the floor is yours. And the session will be wrapped up by my colleague, Nikos Kostopoulos. So I also leave you to his capable hands. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this will be so I'll just show you what we do. So I lead the institutional growth for Aave. Aave is the world's, least best known decentralized finance protocol, with one of the best known DeFi protocols, with approximately 21 billion in deposits now, and it's governed by a DAO. So if you just go into the Aave protocol here and you click on governance, then you can see how that there are a number of proposals that have been created by the community. So those those proposals are voted on by token holders, and it's possible for token holders to delegate their voting power and proposition power. So so if I want to create a proposal, if you go to the governance forum here, then you will see a number of proposals and so on. So everything starts with a discussion. There are lots of discussions, and then some discussions become proposals as they mature, and there has been a fair amount of brainstorming and discussion around some of the ideas. Then they become proposals, and then those proposals are then voted on by token holders. And it's also possible for me to delegate my voting power or proposition power. Proposition power is the power to create a proposal, and the voting power is the ability to vote on a proposal. Once the proposal is voted on, then it's the proposal becomes eligible for and proposal typically includes a code change, and that code change then gets into a time lock, and then so this creates essentially an opportunity for permissionless innovation, which means anyone can essentially contribute to the growth of the protocol, and they don't even have to be a token holder. So this that creates I think this is a little bit like a future of work. The other DAOs we have associated with this protocol now are if you go on Telegram, then you will see Aave Grants DAO. It's a very so we essentially so the goal is to do less and less with the team and more as part of the community. So there is a grants proposal you can apply, or anyone can apply for a grant, and they describe what they want to do, and then that is voted on by the member of the grants DAO, which are external to the team. So there is a bunch of people here who have no relation to the team, and to the Genesis team that created this. Now we are also setting up a risk DAO, so that so the goal is that when you go to docs.aave.com and you click on governance forum, or you click on governance guide here, so that kind of describes how the governance works, how you create the Aave request for comments, which are the first step in the governance improvement process. And then those become what we call, AIPs after a discussion period, which is an Aave improvement proposal. And that proposal includes a code change, right? So now what we're doing is even the new asset listing, which is where you sort of want to, include an asset in Aave for listing alongside these or delisting. Then all of that will also be, and the risk parameters and so on, that will also be done by another DAO, which is called the risk DAO. So the goal is to, to use the DAO mechanism as a way of making the protocol fully community owned. And, so for example, the private keys that are required for making code changes or code upgrades are already, owned by a DAO, by the, and the team has no access to essentially make code changes without approval, from the governance. So I think this is, so DAOs are kind of core to DeFi and decentralized protocols. One of the things that the DAO does, right? So how is the DAO funded? So if you look at, so there is a fee mechanism. If you go to our DAO, and you say, risk framework, then there is associated with every asset, there is risk parameters, there is a reserve factor, and that reserve factor, so when a lender pays a borrower, the reserve factor is what goes into the ecosystem reserve, and the ecosystem reserve is what's controlled by the DAO for essentially, growing and improving the protocol, and sort of that sort of reinvestment in the decentralized protocol is what drives the growth of the protocol. Now, so how much does the DAO collect? So that varies quite a lot. So now the Aave ecosystem reserve, which is kind of controlled by the DAO, has over $3 million. But the weekly fees have been growing quite a lot. So so that should create a decentralized organization that essentially has quite a bit of funding over the next year to continue to reinvest in its growth and sort of grow the protocol and the ecosystem. So that's kind of how, that's one way to look at DAOs in action. And we also contribute to a bunch of other DAOs and as a protocol. So Aave, so there is this interaction between DAOs where, let's say, the Aave, a DAO will essentially contribute to interact with other protocols, like MakerDAO will potentially influence the voting in those protocols. So there is this interaction of these online democracies, which is actually quite fascinating. And there is a role called protocol politician, where people who have a deep understanding of different protocols look to influence voting and look to influence kind of the direction, the technical or the functional direction of the protocols as the protocols grow and mature. So this type of internet-based, democracy of strangers, if you will, and permissionless interactions and innovation are some pretty powerful ideas. Now, these ideas have existed, before. It's not that, a lot of these ideas or challenges associated with democracy are new to DAOs per se. But what's become possible is for, pseudonymous or anonymous strangers on the internet to interact with protocols, at web scale, and that's not happened before, right? So you had to be pretty local to vote and so on and so forth. So that's not true anymore. Now, what's also particularly interesting about this this entire experiment is, we sometimes run into the same challenges as democracies. So, how do you get people motivated to vote? How do you, and then gasless voting helps. If there is a cost to voting, then people don't vote as much. Now, sometimes when they're not interested in a proposal or they want to vote no, a lot of people who want to vote no just abstain and don't vote at all, which is similar to, some of the voting challenges we see in modern democracies as well. Then there is the risk of, malicious proposals. Where potentially someone with a lot of tokens wants to hurt the protocol or wants to have an adverse effect. So Aave governance provides a role for guardians, and the role of guardians is, for example, to review any proposals that are potentially adverse or risky, and these guardians again don't work for the team. They're independent and quite reputed individuals, and they vote using a multisig. So so it's a 3 out of 5 multisig which is used to which can be used to veto malicious proposals that would potentially have a negative impact on the protocol, but have enough voting power. So if there is votes that have been captured by someone with a malicious intent, and so these experiments are quite phenomenal in the scope and scale of what they're able to achieve. And it's still there's quite a bit of, I think so there are experiments we're doing with things like quadratic voting, which reduces the impact of wealth effect on democracy. So for example, if in the US campaign financing scenario, where if you have a lot of money like the Koch brothers, you can have an impact on the direction of polity, and not necessarily for the advantage of the greater good. So that can happen in DAOs as well. So there are experiments around quadratic voting, where you need to have 4 tokens to have only 2 votes, and that sort of reduces the wealth effect and allows for a very interesting dynamic in DAO governance as well. So this is a quite a rich field of research and experimentation, and what I think DAOs have been able to achieve already across Uniswap, Maker, Aave, and a bunch of other protocols is quite phenomenal, and very exciting times ahead. That's pretty much it from me.
Thank you, Ajit, for the insightful presentation. We'll go to our last speaker for today, Dr. Michael Gebert, the chairman from the European Blockchain Association.
Hello there. Hi, I hope you hear me all, and greetings from hot Munich. It's very hot here, and so thank you for having me. And I'm also have a small presentation prepared, so let's see if I can share my screen, which is perfectly working. Here we go. All right. So first of all, thank you for all my previous speakers. It was a very, very deep insight into DAO, and of course, all decentralized autonomous organizations is a critical matter also for us as a European Blockchain Association, as we see that the traditional making of business, which we see on a day-to-day basis, is really mostly a struggle, and it's something totally new. And even all of us, including of course you as experts, are into that topic in a very, very deep manner, and researching it and giving out the reports and research papers. For 99% out there of the people we struggle or we talk about on a daily basis, it's something totally new. And if we really just try to focus on 1 or 2 specific opportunities, it's for those people instantly something great. It's very exciting times. So I'm here, and I'm happy to be invited. Thank you for that, to talk about the European Blockchain Association and why we choose also the structure and the governance model of a decentralized autonomous organization. And we basically really looked into a decentralized semi-autonomous organization, a DSAO. And so our structure is a derivative of an original DAO that describes the type of networking connections individual nodes that act automatically on a basis of self-created rules, and a governance model, which is underlying our work. But the key differentiators between the EBA, the European Blockchain Association, and a traditional DAO is that the EBA was founded by a legal entity, the European Blockchain e.V., registered in Germany as an association. And the DSAO is supported by a set of governance processes headed by the EBA board. And this facilitates the integrity of the EBA into the society at large by addressing social, legal, economic, and of course, environmental aspects, and acting as a contact person. On the other hand also, and this was the reason why I joined in a very early stage, the idea of a European Blockchain Association, because there are so many great associations on a country level, on a super level, on a global level, Why another association? So the association itself is just there because to have a legal status, but the idea why I was fascinated was the decentralized aspect and the governance model. So how does it work on a daily basis? So basically, if we look into our structure itself, that then we have a core principle that we really want to support with your work, with the other association work, and synchronize and combine. We don't want to interfere. We want to be as open as possible, kind of an open source project for everybody to be part of the working groups that are initiated as from members. So we don't have really a guideline saying these are the things we want to do. What we have is we have a decentralized tool set, I would say, that gives people the possibility to work with the tool set we provide, and then out of this tool set, use it as a decentralized mechanics tool in order to be successful, or in order to give speeches about it, or even have an academic and research integration, or give out certificates as we have it with the University of Munich, for example. So it's really kind of a diverse set of tools, which I will show you in just a second, and which is of course not still, which is kind of always on a very dynamic and variable part in order to develop. As a whole thing is very dynamic. So the framework itself is, as I said, it's serving as a superior neutral body, and really bolding on neutral, to aggregate and coordinate blockchain activities throughout Europe. So how is that paid, of course, you would ask, and there is no funding by a larger organization, and there is no funding by a superior body like the EU Commission, or let's say the German state or the Austrian state. No, it is totally funded by individuals, and individuals, I mean corporations who are members, who want to move something, or individual persons who see the opportunity, as the system and the whole concept is still so new, to bring it in their existing ecosystems. Logistics, for example. We all talk about logistics implementations, but it's not really common in logistics at all to use blockchain or DAO association mechanics on a very practical operational level. And this is where we come in and support those organizations, and they are basically getting us the budgets and giving us the opportunity through the budgets in order to prosper and develop. However, as it is a DAO organization, and we have heard that throughout the whole afternoon, is as a concept of a DAO, it is per se a very slim and very, very eager economic way of doing business, and also doing business as an association. So our cost structure is compared to any other association, of course, therefore, by default, very, very low. And it is designed, therefore, also with their own crypto asset, because as you know, crypto assets are, of course, in every newspaper that you at the moment put your nose in, but people don't really try it. So we designed from the day one, concepting our DAO as a DAO concept and framework, an XSC coin, which is tradable, which is usable, and which is also usable on a pilot stage. So giving people the possibility to use that as one of those tools, which I described as a tool set, for their, let's say, academy events, virtual hubs, live hubs, which will hopefully come, work groups, or even capital like venture or smart money capital investments, is a very, very good tool in order to try and error before they really start into the market. So the protocol itself is, of course, based on that. So here I give you a little bit of the tool set, I would say. We call it EBA nodes. So there are, of course, pre-COVID times, local blockchain hubs, which we have a couple of those still existing in Europe. These are at the moment, of course, kind of prospering in a step-by-step approach and opening up, and also achieving more attraction as we go through the summer, hopefully, and the COVID situation is handled. Then we have a lot of virtual blockchain hubs, which are all over the 27 member states, which is very interesting for us. We all bring those virtual hubs together on a monthly occasion like this one. It is a little bit more intimate in terms of participants, because these are basically the owners of those virtual hubs, and we are corresponding on different manners on a day-to-day basis and on a monthly basis, what's going on and where to go and which are the topics to solve. And the Academy is one of those tool sets. So we developed together with the University of Munich and with 3 other universities on the other slide, you will see it, academic framework and curriculum that can be used free of charge as one of the tool sets in order to have a step-by-step, I would say, bachelor level education in different attires when it comes to blockchain topics. And it can, of course, be used as kind of a groundwork in order to build up on that. Use it as a webinar series, use it as a live event, or even use it as kind of a hybrid event. All is already done and has been done successfully. So this is a very good tool set that is used at the moment, especially the last 18 months, very aggressively. The events, of course, were a little bit hidden down. However, we had several hackathons. As you know, the developers are used to remote work even before COVID. So the hackathons itself were kind of always kind of a hybrid DAO decentralized structure. And there we put in several issues, and the hackathons really try to solve those issues with also a certification and, of course, also winning prize money or winning prize coins, however the hackathon in that specific topic is structured. The Crowdstart Capital is a startup accelerator. It is still in a beginning phase, but it is quite interesting as we have throughout our member structure a lot of ideas, natural born out of teams within teams that want to try something and that need not only the tool sets, but also actual money, not only crypto, but fiat. So through that, we are able to provide in a very early, very seedy kind of way, access to being open for this put of money and put of fiat in order to make them able to work and do their structured work and develop their ideas in a faster pace and hopefully in a very successful pace. Then we have a RAI, internal payment and accounting system, which is right now developed also on a real estate manner. So one of our working groups, which is not officially on the website, but it's kind of in the back door, is a real estate working group, which is using those payment and accounting system as a decentralized and blockchain-based system for a larger real estate implementation for real estate developers, but also real estate holders, which is very interesting because the demand was, as I said, not really on our plan. It was not identified by us per se, but it was identified by a group of our members who then structured their approach and used our structural framework and governance model in order to go the next step on the structural decentralized model to develop now kind of a product or let's say kind of a pre-product and the proof of concept for this accounting system for the real estate world. The award and currency system is more or less a XSC gamification award system where we have internal tenders that we kind of generate for specific needs or also for specific goals, driven by the work groups, driven by the members, or driven by partners, let's say universities, or even practical implementations. Like we have one of those at the moment running from the automotive sector and together with the University of Canada. And so it's under NDA, so I can't really talk in specific details, but they use those XSC reward systems in order to motivate and kind of structure a more a reward gamification approach in order to get more output of it. Very interesting, and it works. I'm always fascinated how the dynamics are behind it. And the working groups, of course, is kind of the base model. The working groups work also after a very simple but very structured approach. So of course, first comes the idea, then comes the structured possible member setup for this working group. And one example is the staking working group, the staking facility working groups. The idea was from the staking providers, the companies who are doing staking, we have billions of dollars staking power. However, we don't really know how the regulatory body and the authorities will react in the future on staking. So for us, our need is to join forces, even via competition, and use that joint forces in order to qualify a good output, naming what is staking about, where we want to go. Are we the good guys or the bad guys? Obviously, we are the good guys, and this is what we do. And they used that working group for a staking facility and facilitator white paper, which is now widely spread with over 200,000 downloads through the different channels and with a great impact for them. So it helped them to use that paper. And the next step, of course, is now practical cases, meaning best practices and use cases in order to qualify for the next level. So the working group is really, I would describe it as a decentralized way of working together on a governance structure, formal ways, but open for the goal set. So the governance, group governance, as I said, is therefore a similar approach to the governance approach accepted throughout the industry. So this is a decentralized, semi-autonomous organization. It's inspired from open source. This is our rule set. So it has to be open, it has to be qualified, and it has to be re-evaluated basically on from step to step. And the local hubs, the EBA committee, the work groups are responsible for complying to the EBA statutes by this semi-autonomous inaction. So of course there is the board, but the facilities and the possibilities within the working group powers are tremendous once you use the tool set. The local hubs, I just want to go there in very, very briefly. So the local hubs serve, of course, as a kind of physical meeting point, as a meet and greet point. This is a working basis for the blockchain startups. So we have had now one in trial in Portugal, which was very, very interesting and very nice because it was kind of a first very small trial after COVID. And we had this week, in the beginning of the week, one local hub trial on Thessaloniki, which was also very promising, especially as it was combined with a mini hackathon. So you see things kind of go back on hopefully the old route pre-COVID, and they are using the framework in order to regenerate the attention and regenerate vitality on not hybrid but on physical events. The working groups, as I said, are at the moment 3 hyperactive ones, and this is the proof of stake working group, the OIPOS, the SSI working group, the OSSI, and the tokenized working group, which is here under development. It's right now, actually the last 2 weeks, where the funding phase, so it's already funded and it's open for business. And of course, with all 3 working groups in place, my attention, why I'm here in this forum with you guys, is of course to hear you, but also to invite you welcoming and open-armedly to be part of this working groups if you are interested in one of those specific topics, or if one of your partners and networks is interested in, because the more we know about it, the more we cooperate, the better. The academy, as I said, this is just a small part of the companies or the universities and academic bodies we're working together. It's in Barcelona, it's in London, it's in Armenia, which is also super interesting for us because especially those pre-communist, post-communist countries are, for our understanding, hyperactive and really have tremendous output. So it is for us super exciting to see what's going there. We kind of act as a permanent knowledge base. They act as a feedback channel, and we provide, if needed, curatism and also, of course, as I said before, kind of a framework of the academic structure in terms of curriculum, if needed. So the educational program consists then of workshops, e-workshops, webinars, certification programs. How deep they want to go is really defined by the specific partners on a national or local level. So the events itself, which are structured, co-hosted or structured by us, are just a small part of this. I'm personally, which I'm very happy that I'm late today in the afternoon because I'm a little bit jet lagged. I'm coming back from Miami from the Bitcoin conference, and as you may have read, it's over 12,000 people. It's crazy. Miami was really something that was hyper busted, and I'm really looking forward to have those live events back also in Europe and see those vital and very motivating attires in order to bring the whole industry and the whole basically working together, like your forum, the Observatory forum, and all the other great networks together and bring it as a European engagement forward. So, and the stakeholders itself, we have this member structure, as I said, where is the budget coming from? We have individual members. And these guys are basically really individuals who are there and working and having a network. Institutional members are the universities and of course corporate members. I have to say we have no members who are not active, which is very nice. So normally, I'm normally, if I want to be a member in an association, I pay my my association fee and then mostly lay back and look what's coming. Here, obviously, it's a little bit different. You be part of it, and then basically you are more than willing to be part of it, and also very, very active. And this is at this time, knock on wood, really something that which we have preached and which we really like very, very much, is that all the members who are members at the moment are actively involved in the working groups and in the development of the different themes that we provide at the moment. So that's about it. As I said, you're more than welcome to join us or just send me a mail or one of our colleagues, and we are super happy to look together into this bright and positive future.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you everyone for joining the workshop today. Unfortunately, we don't have time to address the questions. All questions will be answered offline in the workshop report. We'll follow up with the workshop recording and presentations. This session will now close.